Well, good afternoon, everybody. The Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will now come to order. You may have seen that the title of today's hearing is the Reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, Oversight of Fisheries Management Successes and Challenges. I'm Senator Dan Sullivan. I want to thank everybody for being here. I have the good fortune of being named at the beginning of this most recent Congress the chairman of the Senate's Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmospheres, Fisheries, and the Coast Guard, which has jurisdiction over our nation's fisheries in federal waters. And this is the first field hearing that the subcommittee is doing anywhere in the United States, and of course, you're not surprised that we're doing it here in Alaska. With me today, I have two staff members, professional staff members from the Senate Commerce Committee, Emily Petralia and Cindy Qualley, along with staff members in my office, Tom Mansour, who's a Coast Guard officer on detail to my office, Scott Lethard, who's the staff director of the subcommittee, Elena Spraker, who many of you know from my Kenai office, and my chief of staff in Washington, D.C., Joe Balash, who some of you may know on a very different but important topic to the state of Alaska, has recently been named by the President to be the Assistant Secretary of Interior, in charge of all oil, gas, minerals, onshore, offshore, not only for Alaska, but the entire country. So Joe will be going through his confirmation hearing in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, chaired by Senator Murkowski, in a couple weeks. So we'll be losing Joe, but America and Alaska will be gaining a strong advocate for our state and the country on some very, very important issues that we're not going to be talking about today, but I just want you to know that. Today's hearing is the second in a series of hearings that I am chairing, which focuses on the long overdue reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. We shorthandedly refer to it as the MSA, to examine this law's impact on managing our nation's fisheries, its successes, of which there are many, and areas of improvement. And again, I first want to start by thanking our hosts. Gary, thank you, and the Kenai Peninsula College. I also want to thank the Kenai River Sporting Association for their help in organizing this important event. This year, the Kenai River Classic celebrates 25 years of raising funds for conservation, education, and other projects in South Central Alaska, and I wish the organizers another very successful event week. I also want to thank everybody for being here today. We have an all-star list of witnesses who are going to be testifying on three different panels today. This is an important hearing. I know that many of you traveled throughout parts of Alaska to be here, and some of you have traveled literally thousands of miles from the lower 48 to be here, and I want to personally thank everybody for the travel, sacrificing their time, even sacrificing their time out on the water fishing. Earlier this month, I chaired a hearing in Washington, D.C. that solicited testimony from the Regional Fisheries Management Councils and NOAA. And today, what our intention is to have the opportunity to broaden the amount of testimony and witnesses and different points of views dramatically from all kinds of different stakeholders in our fisheries. You know, one of the things that I just want to emphasize, this is an area where I see significant bipartisan opportunities. One thing, when I'm back home, I try to talk about what's going on in Washington, and you often only hear about the conflict and where things are not working. There's also a lot of things that are working from a bipartisan perspective. I'll just mention one that relates to fisheries. We had a bill called the Save Our Seas Act, recently passed the Senate. That came out of the committee that I chair. It was a bill that I authored, but it had numerous Democrats and Republicans dealing with a really important issue that relates to this topic, and that's the issue of ocean pollution, ocean debris, and you can't help but see that throughout our state. So there's progress there. We want to make sure that as we look at reauthorizing this bill, that we hear from as many impacted stakeholders as possible to make sure that we can build consensus, to make sure that the next generation of young men and women in our fisheries, whether in Alaska or throughout the country, have opportunities for strong, sustainable fisheries and strong, vibrant coastal communities. So when you look at the witness list, it literally covers the Pacific Northwest, Southeast United States, and every corner of Alaska, from southeast to the interior and Kodiak and everywhere in between. We're fortunate today to host a robust group of witnesses representing both geographic diversity and, importantly, a diversity of experiences and perspectives. In addition, I'm eager to hear from our state and regional federal managers to gain their views on management successes, challenges, and how Congress can provide additional direction or tools to further their mission and enhance state and federal coordination, which is so critical with regard to our fisheries to enable them to thrive for the next generation, whether they are commercial, recreational, charter, or subsistence. The MSA has successfully Americanized our fisheries and built the fishing industry into Alaska's largest private employer. A lot of people, even in Alaska, don't realize that, more than any other industry. And as I constantly and perhaps annoyingly remind my Senate colleagues back in Washington, D.C., Alaska's fisheries are by far the largest in the nation, accounting for well over 50% of all total domestic landings in the country. We literally are the superpower of seafood and probably considered the best managed fishery, certainly not without its challenges, but the best managed fishery in the United States and probably in the world. At the same time, we know that we have challenges, and we know that we have opportunities, and we see them even this summer. Like most Alaskans, I've been out doing my fair share of fishing this summer. Was on the Yukon River, where my wife's family has had a subsistence fish camp for generations. Saw a strong run there. Was out fishing in Seward. Saw a lot of opportunities out there. And just yesterday was in King Cove and saw a strong fishery there. In 2017, we saw a near record sockeye run in Bristol Bay. Meanwhile, Southeast Alaska is experiencing unprecedented closure of sport and commercial king salmon fishery. And the sport king fishery in the upper Copper River was closed this year. As I noted, the Yukon River saw the best king fishery since 2003, while the Kuskokwim saw few kings, but an abundance of reds and chums. The Gulf of Alaska saw an early closure for some groundfish species. These are just a few observations, some challenges related to management, while others are a function of biology, and I think our witnesses are going to help us understand these better. The key is providing the greatest overall benefit to the U.S., the entire country, through recreational opportunity and seafood harvest without jeopardizing conservation. And that is the greatest responsibility that Congress has assigned to our fishery managers through the MSA. This requirement is often a strained balancing act, and we recognize that, and forces tough choices between competing interests. But again, I think what we're trying to do here is look at ways to achieve consensus. At a recent hearing in Washington, Chris Oliver, the newly appointed Assistant Administrator for NOAA Fisheries, the Director of the National Marine Fisheries Service, NMFS, and I'm proud to say the first ever Alaskan to permanently hold that position, testified as follows, quote, "I believe there are opportunities to have it both ways, to maximize our domestic harvest potential without compromising the long-term sustainability of the resources we manage. So for many Alaskans and their families, fishing is a way of life. As Congress considers the reauthorization of the MSA, we are focused on seeking the sort of solutions that Chris Oliver has confidence exists. I hope today's hearing will further guide us towards that goal. I am committed to ensuring that our nation's fisheries management system supports a stable food supply, recreational subsistence opportunities, and plentiful fishing and processing jobs that provide for vibrant coastal communities here in Alaska, but also across the United States. And with that, I'd like to get started and turn to our first panel, which consists mostly of state and federal officials and the public management bodies that make decisions with regard to our fisheries. So I want to welcome our witnesses, Dan Hall, who's the chair of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, Commissioner Sam Cotton, who is the commissioner of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Reed Morsky, member of the Alaska Board of Fisheries, and Spud Woodward, director of the Coastal Resources Division, Georgia Department of Natural Resources. Dr. Woodward, I think you might get the award for traveling the furthest. So we want to thank you for being here as well. Each of you will have 5 minutes to deliver an oral statement, and a longer written statement will be included in the record for this hearing if you so wish. That also reminds me, this hearing will be open in terms of the record for 2 weeks, and we would encourage any and all, and we will leave the contact information for additional testimony from any members of the audience who would like to submit written testimony that we will look at, read, I promise you, and consider as part of this hearing, even though you weren't able to testify as one of the witnesses today. So each of you, as I mentioned, will have 5 minutes, and we look forward to interesting discussion. And again, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Dan, can you please kick it off?
Good afternoon, Chairman Sullivan, Ranking Member Peters, and members of the committee. First, thank you for holding this field hearing in Alaska and for the opportunity to testify on the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, or MSA as we say in shorthand. My name is Dan Hall, and I'm chairman of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. Fisheries are extremely important to the economies, coastal communities, and cultures in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, and we have developed a sustainable fisheries management program in Alaska over the last 40 years. Thus, the North Pacific Council believes that the current MSA and the 10 national standards already provide a very successful framework for the conservation and management of our nation's fisheries resources. Nevertheless, we also recognize the potential benefits of increased flexibility in some circumstances to allow regional councils the opportunity to optimize their management programs with the appropriate cautionary notes. We agree with and support the Council Coordinating Committee's consensus positions on MSA reauthorization provided by Dr. John Quinn recently, and I encourage the committee to take advantage of the collective wisdom of the CCC as work on reauthorization moves ahead. I want to highlight several issues in particular, beginning with modifications to the ACL requirements, which we believe are the cornerstone of sustainable fisheries management. The process for setting ACLs through the Council's scientific and statistical committees includes accounting for uncertainty, articulating policies for acceptable risk, establishing necessary precautionary buffers. We continue to believe that the SSCs are the appropriate gatekeepers for making those determinations. Any changes to the law providing additional flexibility must continue to ensure that fundamental conservation and management principles are upheld and should not create incentives or justifications to overlook them for the sake of preserving all economic activity over the short term. Second, more specific to the North Pacific region, we believe an amendment to remove the August 1st, 1996 date from MSA Section 306A3C is essential to effective management and enforcement of the fisheries. This would ensure that the delegation of salmon management in the EEZ to the state of Alaska would include vessels not registered with the state. Mr. Chairman, I also want to correct my written statement on the recusal issue to reflect that continuation of the full attribution policy is a NOAA agency decision and not a decision by NOAA GC alone. Next, incorporating the National Environmental Protection Act requirements into the MSA to achieve a single guiding statute for fisheries management is consistent with the long-standing views of our council and the CCC. However, we are concerned that the ultimate result will be contingent upon implementing regulations, and realized benefits could be marginal relative to creation of new complexities and costs. In our view, this issue certainly deserves closer scrutiny. Lastly, we concur with the CCC's concerns regarding the challenges that councils face to meet important new national policy directives and the adequacy of funding to continue at-sea surveys and stock assessments. In the North Pacific, the high quality and coverage levels of fishery surveys and stock assessments have been essential in achieving sustainable fisheries for so long. With reductions in surveys and stock assessments, it becomes harder to achieve optimum yield in the fisheries as defined in National Standard 1. Greater uncertainty in estimates of abundance typically results in more conservative approaches to management and lower harvest levels to buffer against the potential for error and maintain conservation goals. My written testimony also includes 4 examples of successful fisheries management in the North Pacific under the existing MSA: Chinook salmon bycatch management in the Bering Sea, the Observer Program and development of electronic monitoring, the management of halibut allocations between the commercial and charter sectors, and the development of ecosystem-based fisheries management. No management program is perfect upon implementation, and all of them require review and revision over time. But all of these actions have been possible under the existing structure of the law, and there are several important underlying themes in all of them. First, the significance of a well-structured national policy framework that provides broad objectives with sound guidance, recognizing regional differences and allowing for the development of regionally based solutions. Second, the critical importance of science and analysis in stock surveys, assessments, fisheries-dependent data collection and monitoring, and research, including social and economic research. And finally, ensuring accountability in all that we do through monitoring and data collection in the fisheries, review of catch share and other management programs, and broad stakeholder participation. Chairman Sullivan, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. That concludes my remarks, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Commissioner Cotton.
Thank you, Senator, and I'll add my thank you to you for holding the hearing here in Alaska, and also add my welcome to those folks here who are visiting. I'll supplement my written comments too, and note that I'm sure you're well aware that the seafood industry is extremely important to our state's economy, and especially to the economies of our fishing communities. Magnuson has worked well here in Alaska for the most part, and we'd ask your committee and the U.S. Congress to avoid imposing programs here in Alaska outside the council process in either this or other legislation that could result in promoting consolidation, restricting competition in the processing industry, making access to fisheries more difficult for our resident fishermen, or generally having a negative impact on our fishing communities' economies. And we would ask you to seek the support of the state and our fishing communities before creating any new programs for Alaska. On the subject of state management of salmon, tanner crab, lingcod, and some rockfish species in the economic zone, a recent court decision has caused us some concern, and the state of Alaska has appealed a Ninth Circuit Court decision that would require federal intervention in the management of Alaska salmon fisheries. One key point in the case is when a federal plan is required. Both Alaska and NIMS feel the interpretation of the law suggests that a federal intervention is not needed if the fish are currently managed by the state. Both Alaska, the Council, and the National Marine Fisheries Service currently feel that state management of salmon is satisfactory and meets all national standards. The courts interpreted the statute to suggest that you always need a federal plan if you're in the EEZ. So that's the difference of opinion there. We think it's not only important here in Alaska for salmon, but as I mentioned, the state also manages tanner crab in the EEZ, lingcod, 2 different species of rockfish, and I'm told that other states would face similar potential problems. Specifically, pink shrimp on the west coast of the U.S. are managed by states but occur in the EEZ and could also be subject to a challenge, as we have seen in the salmon here. And just generally, Cook Inlet salmon management is fairly complicated, always controversial, difficult to satisfy all 10 or 12 different interest groups in those fish, and to add the United States government as a player in that, on that scene, I do not think would be helpful or a positive addition. On the recusal question, my written comments, I think, cover the comments I wanted to make. I'm led to believe that it's really a matter of NOAA policy guidance that is guiding those decisions on when members have to be recused. And it got a little bit ridiculous at this last meeting when one of the members was required to be recused on a FMP that had to do with essential fish habitat that in no way would have benefited either him or his company personally. So we think that needs a stronger look, and I'm not sure if it needs legislation, but it would encourage you and your committee to work with NOAA on that question. And finally, not on the subject of Magnuson itself, but on a related topic as far as the council's concerned, we're looking at some money problems with observer coverage. So like a lot of programs in state government and federal government, money is an issue, but it's really important, we feel, to improve and increase the observer coverage, especially in the Gulf of Alaska, just because we could get better information, but would also improve the confidence that people could have in the statistics that we now see as a result of a very low level of coverage in some of our fisheries there. So I know it's a tough time for everybody as far as money is concerned, but this is a really important one. I wanted to highlight that one area that we could really use some help with funding. So with that, I'll just say that, just on that subject, the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission just finished their meeting today, and they passed a resolution supported unanimously by all 5 states to also encourage additional funding for observer programs. So thank you again for being here, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Cotton. Mr. Morski.
Thank you, Senator. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony regarding potential improvements to the Magnuson-Stevens Act. For introduction, my name is Reed Moreski. I'm one of 7 members of the Alaska Board of Fisheries. I live in Fairbanks, Alaska, where I have operated a sport fishing guide service for 34 years. I live almost 400 miles from the nearest saltwater. That makes some people happy, others it gives them concern. I have a close family member that has been involved in the commercial fishing industry in Alaska for several decades. The reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Act offers an opportunity to address issues that affect Alaskans and others that depend on our fisheries resources. Questions relating to possible suggestions for how the current management of the MSA could be improved include: will this reauthorization process incorporate provisions for flexibility in the management of the sport fishery? There is concern that the current management structure is too rigid and does not allow for variables the industry has requested while accommodating conservation principles. Will there be an improvement in conducting comprehensive stock assessments to include real-time sport fish catch reporting? There is consensus in the sport fleet that the initial allocations in many fisheries did not adequately reflect what was being taken by the sport fleets, nor did it account for competition between user groups. Currently, every region collects different levels of information differently, and giving answers is typically voluntary. The provided information isn't easily accessible to the average fisherman. Will this be addressed? Will the current data collection program that would assist in resolving these concerns receive adequate funding? A great deal of additional information is needed by all user groups in the waters covered by the MSA. Will this reauthorization process address the need for better catch data and the economic value of the sport fisheries, both direct and indirect? There is a concern that future allocations, dedications of budget, personnel, and management efforts should be made with this economic information available. If the federal government takes over management of the EEZ, that since statehood has been managed under state law, are they ready to determine the harvest limits for each sector? How would the differing management standards be coordinated? How would the federal management mesh with the national standards with state management? Should the national standards reflect the significant presence of sport fishing and other users? The National Marine Fisheries Service has found that the Magnuson-Stevens Act concept of optimum yield is equivalent to the state's sustained yield principle. The state of Alaska mandates the fisheries resources are for the maximum benefit of people. Should the MSA be amended to accommodate multiple users? Coupled with this issue, should the MSA provide for research for freshwater fisheries? Should the MSA national standards incorporate the state of Alaska's escapement goal management strategy? And in summary, although they have similar economic impact, recreational and commercial fishing are fundamentally different activities. Recognizing that the commercial fishing industry is economically important to the U.S. economy, there are over 11 million Americans that enjoy saltwater recreational fishing. The sport contributes over $63 billion to the nation's economy annually and supports over 439,000 American jobs. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify on these important reauthorization issues.
Thank you. Dr. Woodward.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and it was a long trip, but a pleasant one. Thank you. I've worked in the field of fisheries management at the state level for 30 years. I've served on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and I'm currently Georgia's Administrative Commissioner to the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. While our state is the largest east of the Mississippi, we have a relatively small coastline, about 100 miles, but it is one rich in natural treasures, largely thanks to the visionary leadership of state lawmakers who passed laws in the 70s to protect our estuaries and our barrier islands. I'd like to comment from a state perspective about another landmark law of the 70s, the Magnuson-Stevens Act. I'll start by stating the obvious. The Act has accomplished its original intended purpose very well, which was to protect our ocean resources from foreign fishing fleets and unregulated domestic fishing. Amendments in 1996 and 2006 were intended to keep pace with changes in domestic fishing and advances in fishery science and management. As a whole, those changes were positive, and there have been notable and measurable successes in the South Atlantic: black sea bass, red porgy, king and Spanish mackerel, and protection of long-lived and slow-growing deep-water corals. However, the prescriptive nature of the Act has also created unintended consequences in the Southeast. 5 years of a red snapper harvest moratorium and a total of 17 days of allowable harvest since 2010 have left our citizens who fish the South Atlantic totally dismayed. The same can be said for the thousands of Georgians who fish the Gulf of Mexico for red snapper when they learned that federal waters were only going to be open for 3 days in 2017. Fortunately, state and federal authorities reached an agreement to extend that season. However, as of today, the South Atlantic remains closed to the harvest of red snapper, despite a marked increase in abundance to the point that discards and now not harvest is actually the management challenge. Estimates of dead discards, albeit imprecise, have actually exceeded the annual catch limit and perpetuated closures, leading to lost fishing opportunities. Adding to our anglers' frustrations, NOAA Fisheries closed federal waters in the South Atlantic to the recreational harvest of Atlantic migratory group cobia this year. This decision was made as a precautionary measure to prevent the recreational harvest from exceeding the annual catch limit of 620,000 pounds. It's important to note that cobia are not overfished and are not undergoing overfishing. The cobia fishery in Georgia is prosecuted almost exclusively in federal waters and accounts for about 15% of the annual recreational catch. By comparison, over 80% of the recreational catch of the Atlantic migratory group occurs in the state waters of North Carolina and Virginia, which remained open to harvest. So the closure through the Magnuson Act was in essence a de facto allocation of cobia to those states made in full recognition of the uncertainty associated with recreational catch estimates. So our anglers lost a fishing opportunity without there being a commensurate conservation benefit or need. The act as currently applied has made it difficult for the regional councils in the southeast to adapt fishery management to the needs of a very diverse recreational fishery. We deal with dozens and dozens of species in mixed populations. Council members need flexibility and alternative management measures in their toolbox. I predict that you'll hear from some that flexibility and alternative management measures are simply ways to avoid making difficult but necessary management decisions. I disagree. I think they're necessary tools. Council members and staff also need more assessments that are both timely and suitable as a basis for management decisions. Stock assessments are the backbone of good fishery management. But it's important to point out that there is one NOAA Fisheries Science Center supporting 3 councils, ICAT, and highly migratory species in the southeast. Finally, it's time for a realistic acknowledgement that for many species, the Marine Recreational Information Program simply lacks the temporal and spatial resolution, accuracy, and precision needed for sophisticated stock assessment models and for recreational quota monitoring. We need more advanced tools. Congress has an opportunity to amend the act to improve the ability of regional councils to manage the nation's marine recreational fisheries. We know that you and your colleagues have many issues competing for your time and attention, and we very much appreciate those who have introduced and sponsored bills to amend the Magnuson-Stevens Act. We look forward to working with Congress to see them to fruition. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Great. Well, thank you again, Dr. Woodward, from traveling all the way from Georgia. I hope you get a little opportunity to go out fishing on the Kenai here.
5:30 in the morning, I hope.
There we go. Good, good. Well, listen, let me begin with just a very open-ended question, but in many ways, it's the key issue that we're looking at in this hearing. And I'll just open it up to any or all of the witnesses to begin with. But what do you hope to see in an MSA reauthorization, and what issues in particular would you see as your top priorities with regard to an MSA reauthorization? We've heard from different user groups saying, hey, it's working well, do no harm. Others have had a very different view in terms of what they want out of this. So I just really want to open that up to begin with for all the witnesses here today. And again, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony, and we want to continue to work with all of you as we move forward in this process.
I think one of the primary concerns we have is the prescriptive nature in terms of ending overfishing and rebuilding. You know, the Act, when it was amended in 2006 and reauthorized in 2007, had very good intentions to set measurable goals. The problem is we're applying those goals across very diverse fish species and fish populations, and sometimes it's simply impossible to rebuild some of these stocks back, especially if they're long-lived species, in the period of time allocated and mandated by the law. And to do that, if it's even feasible, oftentimes comes with socioeconomic costs that are devastating.
Yeah.
And you still can't necessarily accomplish your goal, but you're inflicting great harm. And so I think that's where the flexibility comes in, to have, you know, regional councils were created to be a composite body of informed decision makers. And they do need, you know, flexibility in their ability to do that. And I think the Act, for all of its good intentions, has taken away some of that flexibility and keeps them from being able to do the best job they can.
So your focus is on more flexibility to the council in terms of decision-making that relates to specific quota allocations?
And validate, well, let's remove annual catch limits when they aren't necessarily the appropriate tool. And let's give flexibility to build stocks back over longer periods of time to properly balance the socioeconomic cost with rebuilding. And then, you know, we also need better information. I mean, you've heard from Commissioner Cotton about funding. I mean, we have one fisheries science center, and the states in the southeast, you know, have various levels of funding, and we don't have the capacity necessarily to produce those kind of stock assessments, but they are the currency of modern fishery management. So we've got to have that too.
Great. Others want to comment on the first question? Dan?
Thank you, Senator. I did touch on one specific issue in my oral comments on the North Pacific Management clarification related to provisions over state jurisdiction to manage fishing activity in the absence of official fishery management plan. We as a council have not met since the invitation to this hearing, so my oral and written comments are based on our previous discussions of Magnuson issues generally, and we have not taken the opportunity to more specifically identify changes that we would offer. With respect to flexibility and rebuilding plans, we do identify the need to look into that in such a way that, again, as I said in my oral testimony, we can provide the regional councils with some of the flexibility that they need to rebuild stocks and to meet the scientific principles surrounding ACLs, but also the social and economic objectives that each region experiences differently, and we've heard that it's seen that from other councils with respect to rec fisheries. Again, we're noting some caution about how those might be changed. Those are issues generally that we see are worth exploring.
Great. Commissioner Cotton.
Thank you, Senator. I think I'm probably in the camp of working well, do no harm, as reflected in a lot of my testimony, but I will take this opportunity to do another pitch on budget items. In the state of Alaska, as I'm sure everybody's aware, we're facing some constraints on revenues, and as a result, all budgets are under close scrutiny. And I think the legislature this year treated our budget fairly well. Have come to a recognition that in order for us to do our job, we do need those financial resources, and as you take them away, we're less able to do a good job. And the same is true here. And I think the gentleman from Georgia pointed out that a similar concern from that part of the country. So again, appreciate strong attention to the budget. And I know there's a push to make reductions in the Department of Commerce, and that will affect us. So I know you're aware of this, but just wanted to echo and emphasize our concern for certainly the potential for reductions, and at least in one case, we're interested in additional resources. Thank you.
Well, I can assure you that, at least from my perspective, full funding for NOAA and NIMS, and particularly the research and data collection component of what they're doing for our fisheries, has been something that I've been advocating for since I got to the Senate. As you all know, you can't manage a fishery well if you don't have accurate and robust data. And so I will continue to press for that, but I appreciate you raising it here. Mr. Mariski, do you have any issues, again, with regard to kind of broader hope to see in a MSA reauthorization, and kind of from your perspective, what would be most important?
I'll also confirm that budgetary issues in regards to what I'm seeing is that on the state level, and hearing also about the federal level, the lack of funding for science and research, in particular on fish runs, it will equate to less accurate management and default to a more conservative management regime. So I am concerned about that as well. Thank you.
Let me turn to another issue that Mr. Hull, you mentioned, Commissioner Cotton, you touched on, but there have been a notable uptick on the North Pacific Council's decision-making with regard to recusals. And can you just give the committee and others a sense of how that complicates the work of the council? And you both touched on it. You believe that that's a NOAA regulatory approach that could address that, or is that something you think we need to look at from legislative perspective, if you think it's a problem at all. We've been hearing, of course, a number of concerns about that.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, there do seem to have been an increase in the recusals, specifically or especially for the CDQ representatives on our council. And this is...
And isn't it a bit ironic, because isn't part of the reason to have the council put together, you want to choose members who actually are involved in the industry and involved in fisheries issues and know a lot about it, which kind of raises the issue of recusal, even though it also raises the issue of knowledge.
That's correct, Senator. They've been successful over the past 25 years getting involved in all the fisheries. Therefore, they do bring a perspective that is both unique and very broad for the council, and not having them, not allowing them to add their voice to our collective decision making is frustrates, we believe, the congressional intent for the program.
Yeah, Commissioner Cotton.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I really appreciate the fact that you're asking a question on that. I mean, it suggests that you're aware of the problems here. In the past, there had been other people that had been told that they would be required to be recused, and what they did to fix that was they shuffled their employment status, removed themselves as an employee, became a consultant, or some other method of, it's the same person sitting there with the same financial interest, and they were able to avoid.
And that worked previously?
That did work.
Okay.
And I apologize if I'm paraphrasing in a way that might have missed a couple of important points there, but that was my observation at the very least. CDQ organizations don't have a designated seat on the council, but they typically, somebody from a CDQ organization typically sits on the council, and it's a very important part of the economy in Alaska, and especially the Western Alaska. So that's the person that's most often been recused, and it's possible that whoever sits there representing CDQ groups would face the same kind of problem. So it's a very important seat, and parochially, you know, the original design of the Magnuson Act gave Alaska 6 votes, recognizing that out of the 11 votes, that gives Alaska a majority if we all decide to vote the same way, that is, but it doesn't always work out that way. But by having the CDQ member be the one that's typically recused, that threatens Alaska's ability to have a strong voice on these issues. So
you certainly want us to look at it, but you think that's something we should explore, whether that's regulatory or talk to NOAA, or is it something that we need to define more clearly in the statute?
My recommendation, Senator, would be to continue to push for a NOAA policy guidance change. If that's not successful, then certainly we would support a change in statute.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask, and this again could go to either Dan or Mr. Hull or Commissioner Cotton. So I was, you mentioned Western Alaska. I was out in Shishmaref the other day, and we did a town hall meeting there, and one of the questions that came up was the broader issue of kind of the closure of or non-fishing of kind of the Arctic waters that extends north of where they are. And yet, from their perspective, some of the people asked the question, just seeing, you know, more migration, more fish. I get this question asked a lot. I'm sure all of you do, look at the council. But what kind of data, what kind of information, what kind of process do you need as you continually evaluate more northern waters in Alaska in terms of what the council would recommend in terms of opportunities, or maybe not enough data to understand the ecosystem there in terms of fishing there? I got a couple questions on that just 2 days ago, and I told them I'd have the opportunity to ask the experts and that I would pitch the question to you. So over to both of you for that question, which at least for me comes up quite a lot when I'm talking to Alaskans.
Thank you, Senator. I'll take a crack at it. I can't recall offhand what kind of surveys are currently being done in those Arctic waters that are currently closed under our Arctic FMP to better understand what the status of stocks is, what's the abundance, how it's been changing.
And they're closed primarily because we just don't think we have the information to make intelligent decisions on any kind of management regime?
In essence, yes. And so until we have that information and are better able to structure some kind of management program that would satisfy the provisions of Magnuson, and the decision has been not to open.
But aren't we seeing a migration of fish stocks north, or is that just anecdotal?
Senator, I apologize. I'm not able to answer that specifically. I would add, however, that the North Pacific Research Board, of which I am chairman as well, has initiated an integrated ecosystem research plan for the Arctic waters, not specifically to address the issue of what is the stock composition and abundance in the Arctic waters, but to understand the process for the production of resources in that region that are particularly important to the people in that area. So that is a 3-year-plus endeavor. It's just begun this year, but that's an example of some of the work that I'm aware of that's going on.
Commissioner Cotton, you have any views on that?
Just thank you very much, Senator. There was a relatively easy decision to close the Arctic. For one reason, nobody was fishing there, so we really didn't take anything away from anybody. But we did say that it could be opened under certain conditions, and we'd have to show healthy stocks that could be harvested. And one thing about the fishing industry in Alaska is they're seldom shy about advancing proposals, ideas, applications for experimental fishing permits. So I would expect to hear from industry as far as interest, and they would contribute to research and do the exploration, I think, if they were allowed, and if they had the interest. If there was a good thought that there might be some money to be made in the Arctic. So.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask Commissioner one other question. Are there any changes in the MSA that could benefit the relationship, and Dr. Woodward, this would be to you as well, between kind of state fish and game regulators and organizations and NMFS and NOAA? Or do you see that relationship is working well? Do you see any kind of structural issues that might be addressed in the MSA to make that more of a cooperative relationship?
Thank you. That's a very good question, Senator, and one that's fundamental to the effectiveness of our fishery management. And you, as you're aware, there have been efforts in the Southeast to extend state jurisdictions out to manage resources in the EEZ, with the belief being that the state agencies had a better understanding of those fisheries and an ability to collect the data. That's a slippery slope, because that does put a burden back on the states to be able to collect that data. From a perspective of a state like Georgia, our territorial waters extend out to 3 miles. We have very little bottom fish habitat until you get 20 to 40 miles offshore. So if we were going to change that relationship to realign jurisdictions, it would be a pretty significant move that would have obviously far-reaching ramifications for more than just fish.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can say that especially in the situation like we're dealing with cobia, I have been encouraged that the Southeast region has accepted that perhaps it's better for states to manage cobia, given the preponderance of the catch that occurs in state waters, than to keep it under a federal system. And I think that's where the relationship really can benefit the most, is a willingness for NOAA to divest itself of management responsibilities when there's a justification for it. We've done it in other species. We've reduced the number of species being managed under federal management, which is already stressed for resources, as I've already alluded to. So to me, that's where I don't know that anything particular needs to be put in the act, other than maybe some language that encourages the councils to look critically at what is in their portfolio and to look for opportunities to pass that to the states.
Commissioner Cotton, you have any views on that?
Just to say, generally, the state of Alaska has felt that we've worked very well with National Marine Fisheries Service, their representative in Alaska, and now we anticipate even a stronger working relationship
Yes,
with
I agree with that.
leadership nationally. And
Good
thank
news
you
for
for
us.
your support on that.
Well, he was, by the way, just so everybody knows, he was supported by every council, every region. So we had a strong Alaskan candidate, and I'm glad we got him in there.
And I think many of the other people that have held that office were certainly well qualified and competent, but I think few have had the experience that Mr. Oliver's had with directly hands-on with councils, and so I think that's really going to be a benefit to not just our council, but
Yep.
but nationally. We've had some areas that we haven't agreed on, though, and typically with the ESA issues, marine mammals, for example, especially stellar sea lions,
Yep.
we'd come to different conclusions on a regular basis on some of those issues, but still feel that overall I'd give a high marks on working relationship between state and National Marine Fisheries Service.
Let me ask Mr. Mariski a related council with regard to the coordination that exists between the North Pacific Council and the Board of Fish. Are there ways that coordination can be improved? And I'm kind of putting you and Mr. Hull on the spot here. I'm sure you're going to say in the testimony that it's all going swimmingly, but if it isn't, what would you recommend?
Well, perhaps more frequent interaction. I've been on the board 4 years now and have not had an opportunity to have the board officially interact with the North Council. So
Well, I'm
perhaps
glad
more-
we could bring you guys together
Yes,
today.
well, thank you for that. And so perhaps a more frequent involvement would benefit both of us, especially with the issues that have been raised here and in other venues.
Do you think right now that the management tools the state and the Board of Fish possess are beneficial from the NIMS and council's perspective to have in their toolbox to manage both the federal and state fisheries? Obviously, in Alaska and more than most states, there's an interaction, there's an overlap. Commissioner Cotton has mentioned a couple areas where the state manages stocks in federal waters. Obviously, you also mentioned the Kenai, which has its own very distinctive history in that regard. Do you think that there's enough proper authorities and tools that enable that relationship to work, particularly at the kind of intersection?
Well, one of the comments that I've heard from my fellow board members is that it's interesting that the North Council has their own staff backup for information gathering and research and whatnot, and the board, although we have access to the department, it would be nice, and this isn't to criticize our state structure here, but I'm just relaying something, and I have also the same sentiment that perhaps down the road, if we could have some kind of a more of a staff on the state side for things that we may research that are board centric.
Okay, good. Thank you. Let me close with just one final question. I quoted Chris Oliver in his hearing just last month in Washington, D.C., where he talks about, there are opportunities to have it both ways, where for additional flexibility in how we apply annual catch limits, subsequent accountability measures, and in those rebuilding plans where we can achieve some flexibility that people are seeking without rolling back our conservation successes in having additional overfish stocks. He thinks we can achieve that balance. As you mentioned, Commissioner is someone who comes to that position with a lot of experience. Is that something that all of you would agree with the new Director of NIMS, that we can hit that balance and sweet spot? Yeah, I'll open this. This is the final question for this panel. So,
All right. So
if you want to answer it or have any other comments, please feel free to make them.
If I might, first, make a comment regarding the State Board of Fisheries and our council interaction.
Sure.
We do have a joint protocol committee between the Board of Fisheries and our council, a subset of each body. We haven't met for, I think it's been close to 7 or 8 years now. So we've recognized on our side the need to interact at times, but haven't followed through. I think that there's, given certain circumstances now, I think we've discussed that warrants a joint meeting.
Well, maybe that can be one positive outcome of this
Yeah.
hearing, since we have 2 of the key players, actually 3 of the key players, to do that.
We also, our staff does brief the Board of Fish on issues that are going through our council that are relevant to issues that they've taken up. So there is some interaction that goes on in between. But with your respect to your question on Mr. Oliver's statement, I think that there are potential opportunities for improving perhaps the harvest side of the equation. I do want to say that it does require increased monitoring of our fisheries, improvements in our stock assessment, because the more information we have about the abundance of stocks, their distribution, their life history, the better able we are to make those decisions about harvest levels. The more monitoring we have of the fisheries, the better able we are to understand the consequences of harvest or the impacts of harvest on those stocks. So yes, I think that there are some ways to do that, but it won't come easily. I can say that as well. So.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to comment on that final question that I posed that quotes the new director of NIMS on what he thinks we can achieve?
I will. Thank you, Senator. And I just for the record let you know that Mr. Oliver's origins were in the Southeast.
Yeah.
So he may be an Alaskan, but
well, I think he claims
we
Texas
yes,
initially, but we claim him now.
So he's
got a lot of
Southeast,
connections.
But, so we have a little pride of ownership of him too.
Good.
But I do think what has said is achievable. I think it's going to take a lot of work. I think it's more than just amending the Magnuson Act. I think it's leadership within NOAA. I think it starts at the regional level and how regional administrators guide their staffs to apply the Magnuson Act and how they interact with the regional fishery management councils. I mean, we see this quite often in our state federal agency interactions, that as you move geographically, oftentimes the Code of Federal Regulations is interpreted differently from place to place.
Right.
And sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not so good. But I think it's going to take both, and it's going to take a commitment of resources. I mean, we're trying to do very advanced fisheries management in this country, and we have got to support it with the resources necessary to perpetuate the billions of dollars of benefit it brings. The legislation currently before the Senate and the House, the Modern Fish Act, they have great potential. Obviously, we've got to look at them with close scrutiny, but I do think it's achievable. I think if the act is amended to show the states that National Marine Fisheries Service is extending the olive branch, so to speak, to try to bridge the gap and correct some of these problems, that there's a willingness on both sides.
Good. Thank you. Commissioner Cotton.
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to say I agree with Mr. Hall and Mr. Woodward that that statement reflects something that really is achievable. And I think the big difference, and I already mentioned this, is the experience that our new director has. The leadership in that service is so important. And while we certainly wouldn't want anybody to abandon a cautionary approach to a lot of fisheries management challenges, that kind of knowledge and base would allow for, I think, a bolder advance on a lot of things that we're all very interested in. So,
great. Thank you. Mr. Mariski, I'll give you the wrap-up final word here.
I thank you for conducting this hearing today and giving us all this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, listen, how about a round of applause for our first panel? And I want to thank the witnesses again and ask our second panel to please come up to the dais. Thank you. And I really want to thank everybody for being here. I think the committee and people observing this hearing are recognizing. You saw that distinguished first panel. Our next two panels are going to be just as distinguished, representing a wide group of stakeholders from different regions, different areas. And so again, I will ask each of our witnesses will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. And if you have a longer statement, we can submit that for the record. And what we have, I would like to introduce our panel of witnesses. First, we have Glenn Reed, who is the president of Pacific Seafood Processors Association. Ben Special, who's the president of Yamaha Marine Group. Linda Belkin, who's the president of the Halibut Coalition and the executive director of Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. Ranger Ahlstrom, who's the executive director of the Yukon Delta Fisheries Development Association. And Ben Stevens, the director of Hunting and Fishing Task Force for Tanana Chiefs Conference. Each of you will have 5 minutes. Mr. Reed, we'll begin with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Sullivan. On behalf of the member companies of the Pacific Seafood Processors Association, or PSPA as we call ourselves, I'd like to thank you for convening today's hearing on reauthorization of the MSA. My name is Glenn Reed, and I serve as the president of PSPA. Our nonprofit trade association represents the shared policy interests of 9 seafood processing companies active in all major commercial fisheries in Alaska. PSPA members collectively purchase and send to market several $700 million pounds of fish landed in Alaska, including salmon, pollock, crab, cod, halibut, sablefish, and other fisheries that continue to achieve sustainable management under the MSA. To accomplish this, PSPA members have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in their operations, including 3 at-sea motherships, 31 shore-based facilities, and 18 Alaska coastal communities from Ketchikan to Dutch Harbor to Togiak. Our members support local economies, bolster the tax base of rural communities, and provide thousands of jobs and infrastructure in remote locations. I want to highlight the interdependencies between commercial harvesters and seafood processors, which define our role as key fisheries management stakeholders. The harvesting sector operates under management measures developed through the Regional Fishery Management Council process, and they must be able to sell their fish quickly. PSPA members and other processors develop markets, buy those fish, turn them into value-added products, yet the value of the product largely depends on consumer demand in highly competitive seafood markets around the world. The influence of global seafood markets on primary processors, including their ability to invest in capacity and equipment necessary to remain globally competitive, must be understood and considered in management decisions in order to achieve optimum yield. Congress defined optimum yield as the harvest level that provides the greatest overall benefit to the nation, and it remains the core tenet of the MSA. Congress also defined fishing communities to include harvesters and processors, and this relationship is critical to realizing the benefits of optimum yield, which are further distributed throughout coastal communities and the nation. To sustain this system, PSPA members support management that ensures fisheries harvests are sustainable. This is the purpose of the MSA and has been remarkably effective. The mandate to utilize the best available science ensures that decisions are based on facts and evidence, which drives performance. Overall, the MSA is achieving its goal in the North Pacific and is not in need of reform. Of course, we recognize there are ways to further update, improve, or streamline the Act. We also recognize there are regional differences that must be addressed and potential benefits of increased flexibility in some circumstances. But any changes should preserve and only build upon what already works in the Act. As PSPA reviews and considers any changes to the Act, we are guided by the following principles and find that any changes should ensure the following. First, preservation and enhancement of stock assessments and surveys must be maintained or expanded. This serves as the basis for all fishery management plans. This requires the cooperation from congressional appropriators, and we find it absolutely necessary for realizing optimum yield in all fisheries and responding to changes in stocks and the environment. New mandates included in any reauthorization should not come at the expense of reduced funding for fundamental stock assessments and survey responsibilities. Second, data utilized in stock assessments and surveys can and should come from many different sources, but they must continue to meet the high scientific standards demanded in any rigorous peer-reviewed process. The Act, which already requires the use of best available science, should not allow lower quality data to receive the same use in management, because doing so would have the effect of increasing sources of error and uncertainty. Third, flexibility is necessary for councils to address the unique and changing circumstances that arise between stocks, sectors, economies, environments, fishing communities, and other regional needs. Managers benefit from having more tools in the toolbox and flexible, adaptable options for implementing them. The North Pacific has several examples of cooperative management programs that have benefited from flexibility, allowing for higher utilization, increased value, lower bycatch, reduced environmental impacts, and more responsive monitoring and management, largely driven by fishery participants in response to council objectives. Sustainable fisheries should achieve optimum yield through flexible and adaptable performance-based management, not prescriptive regulation. Fourth, any rigid mandates directing how management must be conducted should target species or specific needs without setting broader precedent. Congress should avoid across-the-board mandates in order to solve a specific problem in one region. Fifth, management systems and regulatory processes should be streamlined to the greatest extent possible. Unnecessary duplication of analyses or extra administrative steps that do not add value should be minimized. Sixth, council management systems should be transparent and promote accountability. Reasonable public access to and fair representation by participants that operate in fisheries regulated by the council is vital for achieving more effective outcomes. Finally, we find that any changes to MSA should not erode the core tenet of ensuring sustainable harvests. Alaska's fisheries are certified as sustainable through various international benchmarking programs due in large part to the governance systems at state and national levels. All U.S. fisheries that have achieved the goal of sustainability must not backtrack, because doing so would not only affect thousands of fishery-dependent businesses, but it would harm consumer confidence that is increasingly important to seafood buyers around the world. In closing, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share our input with you. I applaud your efforts to ensure that the MSA remains the bedrock of sustainable fisheries management. I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Mr. Speciale.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for allowing us to talk today. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our insights. Again, my name is Ben Special. I am the president of Yamaha Marine Group. My 1,000 team members are responsible for the outboard motor business, as well as 5 marine manufacturing facilities in the United States. We provide products and services to 120 independent boat companies and 2,000 independent retail dealerships, 19 of which are here in the state of Alaska. I personally have been in this industry all my life. We bring a unique perspective to fishery conservation, as our products are used in commercial, charter, as well as recreational fishing. Conservation is a key part of our mission as a company. It is also a true passion for us in the marine industry. We support and are active members in the American Sport Fishing Association, the Coastal Conservation Association, the Recreational Fishing Alliance, the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, as well as the Kenai River Sport Fishing Association here in Alaska. Mr. Chairman, Yamaha and our customers continue to advocate for the bill that you and Senator Cory Booker introduced, the Save Our Seas Act. We support these and other initiatives because we want a lot of fish in the ocean, and we want to ensure healthy fish stocks for future generations of anglers and our children. Today, I would like to focus on the economic impact of the recreational saltwater fishing, underscoring the need to amend Magnuson-Stevens Act. According to the data provided by the National Marine Fisheries, in 2015, over 9 million saltwater recreational anglers took over 60 million fishing trips, spending over $28 billion. These activities directly support 439,000 jobs and contribute $36 billion to the U.S. GDP. While impressive, these numbers don't begin to tell the complete story of the marine recreational saltwater economy and its national impact. It's not just coastal, it touches all 50 states. I'm going to give 2 examples. One, we operate a foundry in Indianapolis, Indiana, where we have 130 Yamaha employees producing 60,000 stainless steel propellers per year, most of which are used in saltwater fishing boats. The waxes used in the investment casting process is supplied out of Cleveland, Ohio. The stainless steel is supplied out of Oil City, Pennsylvania. The minerals used in our alloys are mined in places like Climax, Colorado, or Eagle Mine in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. At our Skeeter Boat Factory in Kilgore, Texas, we have 280 Yamaha employees manufacturing fishing boats, many of which are used in the Gulf of Mexico by recreational anglers for red snapper and other saltwater species. The gel coats that we use in our resins come out of Kansas City, Missouri. The fuel tanks and live wells that are used in our boats come out of Sparta, Tennessee. The aluminum components used in the boat comes from Lake Zurich, Illinois. and the electronic components come out of Arkansas. The materials and subcomponents used in saltwater recreational fishing boats come from all over our great nation. This is another reason why it is so important we properly amend MSA so it takes into account the full economic impact of the saltwater recreational fishing economy. The recreational and commercial fishing are simply two fundamentally different activities needing distinctively different management tools. The original MSA law was enacted to govern commercial fishing sectors. It has done well there. However, the current one-size-fits-all approach has led to many problems for saltwater anglers that are unnecessarily burdensome, huge restrictions, and reduced economic output for our industry. Simply stated, you don't buy a fishing boat and tackle if you can't go fishing. The management strategies are in desperate need of an update. Critical improvements in MSA are included in the Senate Bill 1520. The Modern Fish Act will allow federal fisheries managers to use alternative management approaches for recreational fishing, similar to the state-based models that simply much better align with the nature of recreational fishing. We, all of us, are responsible for protecting the livelihoods of those who depend upon the recreational saltwater fishing economy. Our laws should be written for the good of the nation, not necessarily the good of one single industry. I hope I have shown that recreational fishing supports a large number of jobs, a number of industries, and states. I want to thank you again for the opportunity today, and I really look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you. Ms. Fenton.
Good afternoon, Chairman Sullivan. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. My name's Linda Benkin. I fish commercially on a 38-foot boat with my family out of Sitka. I'm president of the Halibut Coalition, which includes 13 member groups and over 400 individuals who provide halibut to U.S. consumers. I'm also the executive director of Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association and represent both groups with my comments today. Before addressing specific issues, I would state overall that in Alaska and other regions around the country, from our perspective, the Act is working. I would ask that any changes be guided by a firm commitment to conservation. While today I'll focus on strengthening the Act to better support coastal fishermen and fishing communities, we believe this goal can only be achieved by maintaining strong conservation requirements across all sectors. By way of an example, in Alaska, we spent 15 years grappling with the conflicts between a rapidly increasing guided sport halibut harvest and a rapidly declining halibut resource. After Alaska's commercial halibut fishermen took up to a 76% reduction in their individual quotas, the courts ruled in favor of shared conservation and annual catch limits for both sectors. Halibut stocks are now rebuilding to the benefit of all. On a national level, rebuilding requirements have contributed to restoring 40 overfished stocks, which increased the value of commercially landed seafood by 18%, benefiting not only in fish and fishermen, but also the larger seafood economy, chefs, restaurants, retailers, and consumers. We're on the right course, but 38 important fish populations remain at unhealthy levels. We respectfully ask that the committee uphold MSA mandates and hold all sectors accountable for their catch. Even as we recognize these successes and recommit to healthy fisheries, our coalition believes more must be done to address the challenges faced by coastal fishermen, especially young fishermen. In Alaska, as elsewhere, commercial fisheries are a critical and sustainable source of employment, income, and cultural identity. Commercial fishing uniquely allows self-sufficient people, businesses, and communities to flourish in places where other economic opportunity is scarce. Losing access means losing a way of life and ultimately losing community. Young fishermen today face staggering entry-level costs and a level of risk that's equivalent to buying a starter hotel instead of a starter house as your first step in home ownership. These costs, along with the nationwide focus on reducing the size of fishing fleets, has created a crisis in rural fishing communities. In Alaska, the problem is now too few fishermen, not too few fish. We've found that the conservation and management benefits commonly attributed to limited access can be achieved with limited consolidation of fishing fleets, and that more fishermen making a living is better for our communities. In addressing the LAP provisions of the Act, we ask that you and the committee focus on supporting rather than reducing fleet size. Promoting and sustaining the access of community-based fishermen also demands regulations be designed to work for small boats. At-sea catch monitoring provides a prime example. Small boats do not have room to accommodate an observer, but they can fit electronic monitoring devices which capture the data needed for fisheries management. In Alaska, we now have an alternative for small boats, hence coastal fishermen can comply with at-sea monitoring requirements. To assist other areas, we've provided recommendations in our written comment, but I would highlight here the importance of developing programs at the regional level within full engagement of stakeholders to ensure that programs are fleet compatible, cost effective, and designed to be management objectives specific to that fishery. To summarize, the MSA created a successful management structure for our nation's fisheries. We believe the effective and comprehensive application of MSA requirements across all sectors is essential, and we ask the committee to recommit to these long-term conservation goals. We also ask that the committee address the significant challenges faced by young fishermen and the growing impact to rural communities of lost fishing access. Our communities need relatively large fleets that provide jobs, revenue, and long-term viability. Young fishermen need affordable entry-level opportunities and a regulatory system that accommodates the scale of their operations. We urge you and the committee to help our communities realize the promise of National Standard 8, not by compromising resource health, but providing coastal residents with sustained access to local communities. I wanted to thank you for testifying and also to recognize your leadership in introducing the Young Fishermen's Development Act, and to thank you for that.
Okay, sure, thank you. Well, thank you, Ms. Benkin, for your testimony, and agree 100% with the next generation idea that you're talking about for our fishermen, not only in Alaska, but throughout the country. Mr. Ahlstrom.
Senator Sullivan, my name is Ragnar Ahlstrom. I'm the Executive Director of the Yukon Delta Fisheries Development Association, a community development quota group. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to testify today. Since its inception, the Community Development Quota Program has been successful in delivering benefits and economic development to its communities. And that's whether those communities are in Atka with Atka Pride Seafoods, providing a market and a viable economy to that village, or whether it's in the village, one of my villages, Himonak, which provides a market for 500 salmon fishermen and 500 employees. The program is widespread across Western Alaska with varying conditions, and those I think the benefit of the CQ program has been it's been successful in bringing those benefits onshore. In Western Alaska, as you know, Senator, a lot of the projects in Western Alaska have to be subsidized. And maybe subsidized is not a right word. They have the return on investment isn't as great as what we look to offshore. And if it wasn't for the program, and I'll speak to the Yukon Delta, there would be nothing there. I mean, it's scary. Not to denigrate or say anything bad about the regional native corporations or the village corporations or the non-governmental nonprofits there. The only thing that's been working is the CDQ program. It doesn't matter if it's in Norton Sound or if it's in Yukon Delta or if it's in Bristol Bay. What has been working for the average person on the street is this program. I can ramble for more than 5 minutes on this. It's when I see a young person, they actually get taller because we provide them training, a job, or other benefits there. I can go on forever. There's dire needs out there. We have a very young population out there in any one of those regions. High poverty rates, social problems leading to suicides. We had two young ladies in the last 6 weeks in Mountain Village, 19 and 23 commit suicide. Another guy, young man in Lucknock, my village, that committed suicide. Alcoholism rates are high. But when you provide training and you provide jobs, which the CDQ program does, we're not addressing all the problems, but it's the program that's working the best. How is the Magnuson-Stevens Act working for us? I think one thing the groups can agree on is we'd like to see, in the overall program, we'd like to see stability. Now, that's not to say there are problems out there. There are some CDQ groups that would like to revisit allocations. Some of them would like to revisit allocations based on population. Or another group might want to revisit allocations based on proximity to the resource. Or Yukon Delta, we can hang our hat on, we'd like to revisit allocations based on poverty. I think I'm the only one in here that we have infrastructure needs in our villages. I'm the only one in here that uses a honey bucket, for instance. And I know we got good federal money coming for that, but that's just an example. But getting back to the reallocation issue, when allocations were set, there was 20 criteria. And to go through and pick one or the other, maybe it's time, it's been 25 years since the program started. Maybe it's time to do that. But maybe the forum is not here. Maybe the forum is at the Western Alaska Community Development Association. Within that CDQ panel group, there may never be a agreement on reallocations. You pull from one, you have to take from someone else. And so that's extremely controversial. I can go on. I see my time's up. Thank you, Senator. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Alstrom. Mr. Stevens.
Is that on? There you go. Thanks. Senator Sullivan, thank you very kindly for the opportunity. My name is Ben Stevens. I am from Stevens Village, Alaska. Stevens Village is north of Fairbanks on the Yukon River. I serve the people of the interior as the director of the Hunting and Fishing Task Force at Tanana Chiefs. We represent some 37 villages, tribes, that also include a little over 40 communities. I also serve on the advisory panel to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. So I am what's considered a tribal subsistence fisherman. Essentially, the way that I see that is just a guy that takes the fish out of the water and puts it on the table for his family. So I'm a little different in terms of what I think the council is used to. I am here to talk about that perspective being reflected in the new Magnuson-Stevens Act. Last month, we had the privilege, I call it a privilege, to take our family, some tribal members, out to our family fish camp. In fact, I think I ran into you at the Yukon River Bridge. You were going downriver to your camp, I was going upriver to mine. And we saw a whole new picture of the people. Some of the tribal members we took, like you can probably relate to, are just in a rough way, in a very rough way. And the way that we interact on the land, on the river, is something that gives people hope. And that's what we saw, what I saw out there. It's normal for me, but it goes beyond that. Our kids are learning that fish camp culture. They're learning the traditions. I had one kid move from the gutting station to the filleting table. Another kid moved from that filleting table over to the cutting table where we do the salmon strips. These kids are growing. They're 12, 13 years old, and they're packing rifles, and they're protecting the camp. So I'm seeing so much good, and I hear you. we're seeing so much good to that. Some guy I pulled off the street in Fairbanks, he sat on the bank and enjoyed the peace and the safety of the camp. So far from the hazards of being homeless on the streets of Fairbanks. There's so many more benefits that I can expound upon. But I only have a few seconds here. We were lucky this year because our family was able to fully participate in the process of harvesting and cutting the fish and drying it. Since, the past decade, we've had problems. 5 families were at our fish camp. They, in turn, took their share, went back to their extended families, and it just multiplied the love of the fish camp, the subsistence fish camp. I believe that this is a sector itself, and I don't think that this sector is adequately represented in Magnuson-Stevens Act. And what I'm thinking is that I truly believe that fisheries management could benefit from the indigenous perspective. First, we have generations of knowledge about the land and the animals. That goes in tentacles beyond our understanding. It's just a matter of us trying to figure out a way to fit that with Western science. Second, we do have a stake in the fisheries. Salmon is a staple of our people, constituting the majority of the subsistence harvest of fish annually. According to the Federal Subsistence Management Program, the state's rural residents harvest about 18,000 tons of wild foods a year. It's a little under 300 pounds per person. 56% of that is fish. Nowhere else in the United States is there such a heavy reliance upon wild foods. That is putting your hand on the fire. That's one of the reasons why I think that we may be underrepresented. And my final point is that that fish goes far beyond feeding us, far beyond sustenance. I think it touches our wellness as Alaska Native people, because it does get us around that disenfranchisement with the land and the animals. With that, sir, I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stevens, and it was good to see you on the Yukon, and it's an amazing place, as we all know. Let me just offer up kind of what I did to the first panel, a very simple but basic but important question for the purposes of this hearing. And many of you have already touched on it in your testimony, but what would you hope to see in the MSA reauthorization, and what are the key issues from your perspective? And I'll just open that up to all the panelists.
Thank you, Senator. When we look at it, we think we need recreational fishing needs identified within the MSA law, just so it's specific in getting into
And
the real
Mr.
need.
Special, you talked about needs. You also talked a lot about data, and it was one of the questions I was going to ask you in particular, so maybe I'll just do it now. Are the needs mostly based on what you consider as a challenge, which is the lack of data as it relates to sports fishing and that management aspect?
Obviously, one part of what we'd like to see, that's the third item we'd say we need to have, is a more robust data system. I love coming up to Alaska because you guys seem to know everything about the data, but I think in the parts
Is that
of the
true,
lower
Commissioner?
48 you're way better off. I struggle with a few areas of that part of it. But I think it needs a more robust system of data collection, or at least reasonable management approaches, because sometimes this concept of the best available data is not really good.
Yeah.
Many times in business you see that happen, and you can overstudy the things and they come up with the data as opposed to having real information. We'd like to see a fair allocation methodology based off the economic output. The recreational fishing industry is a big industry. It's good for the economy of the United States. That doesn't take away from any other of the industries, and it just needs to be identified because it is so different. And I like the word that gentleman down here used about stability. We need consistency. A guy that buys a boat wants to go fishing. He doesn't want to know one year he's going to have a 3-day season and next year he's going to have a 22-day season and it's not going to be around the following. He wants to see some consistency in it. So I think that's the type of stuff we want to see, is just identifying that recreational fishing is serious, allow alternative management structures, allow for better data collection, use more modern tools. We all have smartphones today, a fair allocation based off economics, and avoid the peaks and valleys.
Great. Others? Ms. Benkin.
Thank you for that question, Senator. First off, our perspective is the most important part of reauthorization has to be to maintain the strong conservation underpinnings of the Act.
Yeah.
Nobody wins if the fish lose, whether you're a recreational fisherman, a subsistence fisherman, or a commercial fisherman. So that above all, and that as we talk about flexibility or alternative tools, that's not code or modern fishing act. There's nothing modern about overfishing, and alternative should not mean overfishing. I guess I would just point out that the average length in rebuilding plans right now is 20 years. There has been quite a bit of flexibility allowed to make those plans specific to the fish in question. So in looking at that aspect of the Act, I would certainly caution against allowing flexibility to compromise conservation. I think next for us, relative to maintaining a great fisheries management system, is adequate stock assessment that's well-funded, monitoring of all fisheries, all sectors, so that we know what's coming out of the resource, doing that in a way that fits the fleets that are being managed. There are certainly tools, smartphones, that weren't around when we designed existing monitoring systems that can be used with far less burden to the users. So we are seeing, as I think Commissioner Cotton mentioned, a real need up here for additional funding for our observer program, for electronic monitoring, as we get that program back to where it needs to be in terms of coverage levels. So those are very important pieces to me of this reauthorization process. I guess the last piece of that I would mention would be the need for stronger socioeconomic data collection. That really gets at this issue of dependency in small communities on the resource, whether you're a subsistence fisherman, a commercial fisherman, a CDQ fisherman. In those communities, I don't feel like we're capturing that. And as a result, decisions are far too often driven by straight economics. And that very important sort of culture and social dependence on the resource is not driving decisions to the extent it needs to be to keep our communities and those jobs in those communities healthy and viable.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to also talk about stock assessments and surveys and echo a few people before me. But I think that in my career in seafood and in most people's from Alaska, wherever you go, you hear about how well managed Alaska's fisheries are. Sometimes it seems like we might be talking to ourselves and it's bouncing back, but I think for the most part it's everyone else we're talking to as well. And the reason for that is that we have strong scientific data and backup. And I think that the job of the agency is to manage fisheries. And there are lots of other things that you can do with the money that you have available to you, but nothing is more important than stock assessments and surveys. And historically, we've had situations where sometimes a politician steps in and is prescriptive in where money should be spent when not enough money is going to areas like stock assessments and surveys. And we're supportive of that. We're supportive enough of those issues to stand up conservation and to stand up our fisheries and to make sure that the fish come first, that's a good idea in our mind, I believe. I think I would agree that in relative to rebuilding plans, there could be more flexibility than just the 10-year plan. There needs to be more flexibility in rebuilding plans in general. But I think that in adding flexibility with rebuilding, you still have to put the health of the resource first. And if there comes a time or comes years when fishing is curtailed or reduced, regardless of the user group, still put the fish first and suck it up and take the hit, so you have a resource in the future for those fishermen and their children.
Mr. Alston.
Thank you, Senator. What we'd like to see in the reauthorization of, is reiterate stability within the CDQ program. We'd like to see the hardened performance caps in the pollock fishery seems to be working, but we'd like to see a periodic review in the Yukon River's rebuilding as far as Chinook returns, but there seems to be a problem on the Kuskokwim. And ditto with the halibut bycatch limits. We're hearing from villages along the coast that halibut seem to be moving offshore because of maybe warming waters or other factors, and we'd hate to see the halibut bycatch increase. It needs to be continually monitored. We'd like to see the pollock and crab stock assessments continue at a robust level. We'd hate to see those testing mechanisms reduced. Specific to the CDQ program, stability would also include keeping that program as is. The program was envisioned and written up to include only those villages within 50 nautical miles that were reliant on the Bering Sea. Sometimes when you have a good program, you expanded it, and then what you have is a weakened program for everyone. We'd like to see that program as is. And one last final note is that we'd like to see the Western Alaska Community Development Association reinvigorated so it can, and I think, do what Senator Stevens envisioned it would do, oversee the CDQ program. And through your the CDQ implementation committee that was, I believe you directed, I think that's the route we'll take in addressing that issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Stevens, any thoughts just on the overview question, priorities, and what you see as your priorities on MSA reauthorization?
Thanks, Senator. I think it's imperative that we include increased tribal representation. When I first got to the North Pacific Council room, I realized right off the bat that it was very thin in terms of tribal DNA. There's very, very little. I say that with all due respect to the hard-working folks that run the operation. But it is what it is, and that is what I think that we would like to see, that and continued vigilance in terms of balancing sustainability and the needs of the world. And, of course, continued vigilance surrounding bycatch.
Good, thank you. Let me get a little more specific. Mr. Reed, you were listening to the last panel. There was a lot of discussion on data. As a matter of fact, everybody is, I think we're seeing one area of consensus, data, sustainability, very, very focused on accurate stock assessments is critical, no matter what user group you're looking at. Let me ask you kind of more specifically, you talked about, and in your written testimony, you talked about provisions related to the transparency and use of data included in any MSA reauthorization. There's also, I think, opportunities, but I'd like your any other views, any other of the witnesses' views, to look at cooperative research programs that utilize state or university or other data. So, the feds aren't the sole repositories of wisdom on the data, but how do we kind of integrate with other data, make it transparent, but also make sure it's reliable, right? So it's got to be good data and good science. But to look at opportunities to expand it, right? There's tremendous research institutions that aren't the federal government. So what's the balance there? What would you like to see? And if anyone else has a view on that, I think we are seeing consensus on one issue, data, funding, which I fully support, but also, can we cast a broader net on better data that can help us all, that's not just driven purely by NOAA and NIMS?
Thank you, Senator. What I was trying to get at with my comments on that point, which I think is a very important point, is that there be transparency in the robustness of the data that you're using.
So that's federal government transparency, or if an agency, state or federal, is making a decision based on data, you want to know what that data was. Is that what you mean by transparency?
It is exactly, and I want to know if is it a peer-reviewed data set? Is it gray literature from an interest group? Is it? I think that traditionally and historically we look at who funded a study and make conclusions without ever reading the study a lot of times.
Yeah.
And I think that's unfortunate, but I think it's true. And I think if it's a peer-reviewed study as opposed to non-peer-reviewed or gray literature, that makes a difference. And all of those things should be right out in the open, regardless of whether it's the government promoting the use of that data to back up their program, or whether it's someone from an interested sector coming forth and testifying and saying, here's what you should do, and here's the data that I'm using to back it up. I think we need to know as much as we can about that when we're using it, and I think we need to stratify the value of that in a consistent way.
And do you think the current law or regs don't emphasize that transparency enough?
I think the current law emphasizes it. I understand there's some initiatives and some interest in changing that a little bit, and maybe putting more value and less transparency on using data that isn't peer-reviewed necessarily, or that is coming from sources that aren't necessarily required to be revealed. And I think that what we should do is the opposite of that. We should just require the revelation of where it's coming from, how it was gathered, what the process was, and then we can fit it into the strata of validity or robustness at the very least.
Let me ask a related question for Mr. Special. How do you think that Congress can help improve angler harvest data, which I know is an issue that you've raised?
We think there's an issue with the data because I see the output of the decisions and I hear the comments. I'm not an expert on the legislative policy and regulatory processes that's involved with that, but we see the very poor output of the information, or very weak information being used to make decisions. This concept of best available data may be allowing the standard deviation or the error factor to be way, way too large, and they're making decisions on it. Those decisions directly affect people who go boating and enjoy the livelihoods of their work, and we need to get that more robustly built up.
And do you think, from particularly the recreational industry side, that is an issue that depends on the state? Is that something where the data is more state-driven, or it's a combination? Again, I think we believe that the data here is not perfect, but it's pretty strong. But is that kind of driven by different state approaches?
I think your state agencies tend to do a better job at it than from the federal level. What we see through the state agencies, they tend to manage the information better because they're directly communicating with the angler. That's actually the challenge you have with rec fishing is there's millions and millions of people, and it's 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s versus commercial where you can measure it and really track it at a much higher level, which is wonderful. And there's so many assumptions in the process we come up with these crazy policies that pop out that limit fishing, and you're going like, dudes, they're really there. They're everywhere. You can see them.
Okay. Any other witnesses want to comment on just the issue of data sufficiency and collection opportunities?
If I could just briefly, Senator, I think, refer back to Chairman Dan Hull's comment about the SSC has to remain the screen for data. As Mr. Reed pointed out, we need to know how that data, the sources of that data, and how appropriate the data is, and ultimately the SSC is qualified to review the information and to feed that information into the management process as being data to be trusted or data that's possibly not up to the usual standards for our management system.
Great. Anyone else? Mr. Alston.
Thank you, Senator. You know, as far as data and data collection, it starts with data collection, and I'll just give you an example, and this is probably true of all the groups. Yukon Delta, we're fully funding a NOAA study on salmon out-migrations, the smolt out-migration at the mouth of the Yukon. I mean, it's $250,000 there this summer, year 4. And in the past, we've worked with ADF&G and others to partially fund it, but this year it's fully funded. And then on the state level, with state cutbacks, we spent another $250,000 on test net for the summer and fall management strategy. So, and it's not only Yukon Delta in this raw gathering of data. It's Norton Sound is the same thing. I'm sure coastal villages, you start digging into it. So as federal and state monies get cut back for one reason or another, they're looking for groups to step in, and a lot of times that the groups that do step in are the CDQ groups.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other, Mr. Stevens, any thoughts on that? Or
Just briefly, we too are very interested in solid data, and may not pertain to exactly what we're talking about here, but we're trying to make sure that the information that the regulatory agencies are using to make these huge decisions they're using good, solid data. And down those lines, we're trying to work with the Yukon River Fish Commission to make sure that we're collecting good, solid data from each community along the river when it comes to, like, the Chinook salmon. So, so the agencies can have the best possible data that we could give them, being on the ground. So, yeah, we do agree that data is critical, especially when it has such huge implications to big decisions.
let me ask a question, Ms. Benkin, on your issue. It's an issue that I've been very focused on the issue of electronic monitoring. I'm assuming you saw the NOAA published regs to integrate the electronic monitoring into the North Pacific Observer Program that came out actually just this month. And it might be, I'm not sure if you've reviewed them, but I know you care about this issue a lot. Are you satisfied with those regs? Are you thinking that's a step in the right direction? And is that something we need to take on? We've been pressing the agencies to do a much better and faster approach to that, as you've been advocating for, given some of our challenges here. What's your sense of the progress and satisfaction with that, particularly given that NOAA just promulgated new regs on that?
Thank you, Senator. We are really pleased to see the progress in the North Pacific. It has been a long process to get to this point of really having an EM alternative for small boats, and a place we probably wouldn't be without support from our delegation and also the supplemental grant funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And I think I would just emphasize that we aren't quite there. This startup phase with electronic monitoring is the most expensive part of getting EM out there. It's when the equipment needs to be purchased, it needs to be installed on boats, and we really do need supplemental funding as we move to the point where it's fully funded by the fleet. If you look at the numbers and you amortize the cost of that equipment over the 5 years that will be its lifespan, EM is functioning at about half the cost of an observer. But the upfront costs are fairly significant. So it's certainly important to have supplemental funding during this time. I think the other aspects of getting EM out on the water that we've found to be particularly critical are involving stakeholders in development of the program initially, but also in guiding what the research and development is for the EM programs of the future, and making sure that future EM systems are compatible with the fleet that they're being designed for, that they are cost effective and not sort of a, a grand scheme for what Star Wars EM might be at some point. So to have them be practical, to be fleet compatible. Then the last point I would make, EM quickly becomes not cost effective if data storage requirements become excessive.
Yeah.
We've seen an interest from enforcement in being able to store that data for 5 years,
Yeah.
for the opportunity to maybe mine the data at some point in the future for enforcement purposes. Where EM is primarily implemented for catch accounting purposes or support catch and bycatch information, our view is that EM data storage needs to be 1 year. At the end of a year, you use that information to inform
Yep.
your stock assessment process, but that to require storage much beyond that quickly makes a program that's very effective, cost-effective, fleet compatible become unworkable. So we would look for some guidance from you on limiting
Yeah.
that data storage requirement.
Well, I appreciate the comment, and we certainly want to continue to work with you and others on this. We think, and I think we've been pressing no on this for, gosh, at least a couple of years, and we want to continue to work with everybody here on that issue as it's being implemented, but I think there are some important advancements on that, so I appreciate that comment. Let me turn, Mr. Ahlstrom, I wanted to dig down a little bit on two issues that you raised one, and then it came up in the previous panel, and I know in some ways you are impacted by it, so I wanted you to have the opportunity to mention it. Are there any aspects, and I appreciated your very constructive participation in that recent broader meeting we had with different CDQ groups, which I thought went quite well, but are there elements of the program, the CDQ program, that you think are in need of update or revision? And secondly, what's your view on the recusal issue, particularly because a lot of times that has seemed to kind of focus on CDQ-related council members, and I think, that's a problem.
Senator, I'll start with the easy one first. We support Commissioner Cotton's remarks on the recusal issue. We believe I'll just read right from my written, we believe the regulatory structure is outdated, not evenly applied, and has recently prevented several voting members of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council from voting on important issues such as halibut bycatch. We ask that the Congress work with affected parties and NIMS to see if there are meaningful changes to the recusal and conflict regulations that would protect the integrity of the council process while still allowing the input from Alaska that was intended by the MSA when creating the council system. There needs to be a change.
Yeah.
Senator, if I remember your first question correctly, you wanted to know if there was a way in MSA that we, the CDQ program, can make it more functional or more easy. I think, within the CDQ panel, which at least Yukon Delta identifies as the Western Alaska Community Development Association, the panel that was supposed to take over for the day-to-day oversight from the state and from the federal oversight teams. I think there needs to be a change where that process items in that process don't need full unanimous support. I think a supermajority of 5 out of 6 of the CDQ group is voting to move a rule forward. I think that would really help to make issues within the CDQ program that are controversial at least will continue to move forward. The program is so important. I feel amiss that I'm not emphasizing how important it is to Western Alaska,
Yeah.
this program. But I think that would be a change we need.
Let me ask Mr. Stevens, you mentioned, and I appreciate your focus on the tribal and subsistence needs and emphasis for our Alaska Native population. Have you thought about kind of looking at ways, because MSA obviously applies nationally, and a lot of the different councils don't have such a large population and the issues that we have in the state on those kind of issues, subsistence and otherwise. Have you thought about how, if we were looking at amending the act in ways that relate to those issues, you could do it in a way that recognizes that it's still a national law, and in a lot of regions, those aren't the prominent issues that are being raised?
Well, I do believe that that it is of such significance that we can't turn away from it. As I mentioned, the importance of subsistence is monumental to the Alaska Native people, the rural Alaskans, considering the fact that we're basically the last in the nation to be so heavily reliant upon this. I believe begs some consideration.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And so,
okay,
Go
no, I
ahead.
appreciate that. Any other thoughts on that, just kind of in terms of the way in which that would be more strongly influenced in a reauthorization, highlighted? Is there language or issues that you have or can
There-
recommend to us?
in our written testimony, we have an addendum to it with some language on it.
Great, thank you. Well, let me ask. I'll just open it up. Any final comments from any of the panelists as we turn to our third panel members? Any last rounds that you want to mention? I want to give everybody a chance to briefly. I want to be respectful of our next panel, but to briefly just emphasize any final issues. Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to, on the issue of electronic monitoring, the closely associated issue of observer coverage, I'd like to state some support for observer funding in the North Pacific. We've paid our own way in the North Pacific in the fisheries that are observed and have been observed for many years, and it would be nice to have some of that paid, as in some areas of the country, 100% of it is being paid by the
Yeah, I
federal
know.
government.
Yeah,
So-
it's an important issue. I'm glad you raised that, because it does seem uneven in different regions.
Yeah, I agree, and we'd appreciate that. And on the electronic side, I think that the future has a good helping of electronic monitoring in all of our fisheries for cost reasons and for the data needs that we have. And so I think that some funding may be transitional in that regard. So we appreciate your consideration of that, and I would also like to thank you again for having us here today and for
Great.
holding the hearing. Thanks so much.
Anyone else for Mr. Alstrom?
Senator, thank you. I just wanted to be not mentioning this. All the groups do this. I'll give you an example for Yukon Delta. We do reach out to the non-CDQ villages. In our plant in Emonic, we have workers, about 100 of them from 18 non-CDQ villages, Upper Yukon, Upper Kuskokwim to the north of us. So all the groups try to reach out outside of their regions to provide benefits. I didn't want to imply this. We have, you don't.
Yeah.
We are reaching out. Thank you.
Mr. Stevens.
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just real
Mr.
quickly,
Fessler.
I'd like to say thank you so much, but we are very concerned about the next draft of MSA and how it goes through, because we are watching what comes from the economic output of it. Of course, we want great conservation as a company. That's what we want. That's what our lifeblood is in this whole thing. And the millions of communities that are affected by this, you have to keep that in awareness. We are not as large as what we were pre-recession, and we think this has been a big driver that's kept our middle market from coming back in the saltwater area. So we would really like to see some positive outcome as we've outlined. So I want to thank you so very much for this time again.
Sure, absolutely. Ms. Benkin, you have the final word.
I'll just close by saying thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think it's been a really great discussion.
Great. Okay, well, how about a round of applause for our second panel here? And we'll ask the third and final panel to please come up to the dais. Thank you.
Drink out of it, huh?
Bless you. Thank you. Oh, we even have pens. Yeah, I know. I brought and paper too. Not used to this.
Yeah, I did. I didn't do anything. Somebody said they look good and it's diplomatic. It's not as quite as diplomatic as my commissioner.
Looks like you're doing better.
This is the first time
What's
I've
that?
been on this side.
Looks
So
like
glad
you're
to
doing
get
better.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Phew. Yeah, this is like old times. It's like on the tape. That's right.
Now you know what it is like to be on the other side of the table. Oh, Brent Payne?
No, on
John Green?
yeah, so I had to show.
Okay, well, I want to begin our third and final panel. Thank you for being so patient. Again, we have a very distinguished panel representing several different stakeholder groups. We want to hear from all of you on your views on this important topic. The final panel of witnesses consists of Shannon Carroll, who's the Deputy Director of the Alaska Marine Conservation Council, Julie Bonney, the Executive Director of the Alaska Groundfish Data Bank, Lori Swanson, Executive Director of Marine Conservation Alliance, Duncan Fields, the Gulf of Alaska Coastal Communities Coalition, and Liz Ogilvie, thank you, Liz, Chief Marketing Officer of the American Sport Fishing Association. So, Mr. Carroll, why don't we begin with you? You have 5 minutes, and if you have a longer written statement, that will be included in the record of this Senate hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll assume best for last for being put on panel 3.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Shannon Carroll. I'm a former commercial fisherman and Deputy Director of the Alaska Marine Conservation Council. Our mission is to promote healthy fisheries, fishing-dependent communities through sustainable fishing practices and local stewardship. We're also a member of the Fishing Community Coalition, which is a national association of community-based and small boat commercial fishing groups. Collectively, we support the MSA and respectfully offer the following comments on reauthorization. Before I do so, however, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hearing from stakeholders at the outset of reauthorization. I think stakeholders are essential to the fisheries management process, and I appreciate the committee for acknowledging that fact. And I also want to thank you for your leadership on fisheries and ocean issues. In particular, we greatly appreciate your support and introduction of the Young Fishermen's Development Act. AMCC urges the committee to take a do-no-harm approach to reauthorization. We continue to believe that many of the issues plaguing various fisheries across the country could be addressed by investing in better and/or more frequent stock assessments, data, research, and accountability measures. Alaska has demonstrated that such measures are indeed the cornerstone of effective fisheries management. And I think the numbers speak for themselves. North Pacific fishermen harvest between 5 and 6 billion pounds of seafood annually, supporting about 9,800 vessels, about 100 processing plants, and generating 14.6 billion in economic output. Recognizing the success, Congress amended the Magnuson Act to bring the Alaska model to the rest of the country, and of the 41 stocks that were listed as subject to overfishing at that time, only 14 remain in such condition. Today, we enjoy the lowest number of overfished stocks in history, while landing revenue is up 18% since 2005. We certainly recognize that fisheries in other regions have struggled under these provisions, but before considering ways to weaken the Act, we ask that the committee consider that in most cases, the root of the problem in these regions is poor data and poor accountability. Adding additional flexibility to annual catch limits may increase those limits in the short term, but it does not address the underlying issues in those fisheries and is therefore not a viable long-term solution. Rather than lower the bar, we urge the committee to consider changes that raise the bar for all fisheries by strengthening the foundation upon which sustainable fisheries management rests: accountability, timely and accurate data. Here in the North Pacific, as elsewhere, that foundation is being threatened. Next year, for example, NOAA may be reducing the number of survey vessels in the Gulf and the Bering Sea, as well as the number of fishing vessels carrying observers due to declining or stagnant funding levels. This loss, among other things, will result in greater uncertainty in the data driving management decisions, potentially leading to more precautionary catch limits and less economic benefit from our fisheries. Congress can help fishermen, processors, coastal communities, and the thousands of small businesses that depend on wild-caught American seafood by investing in the science that allows fishermen to harvest optimal yield on a continuing basis. I also understand that the committee has heard a lot from recreational fishermen about how the MSA is not working for them based on the premise that recreational and commercial fishing are fundamentally different. While we may agree that they have different objectives, the end result of both sectors is really the same. It's the harvesting of a public resource. So I would urge this committee to ensure that sound science and individual accountability are the foundation of any new proposal. We don't believe that the Modernizing Recreational Fisheries Management Act accomplishes this goal. To provide sport fishermen with more fish, it allows fishery managers to use alternative management measures. But unfortunately, these measures ignore precautionary principles for data-poor stocks. They stymie research and innovation by making experimental and exempted fishing permit process unworkable and undermine the 10-year stock rebuilding process. Lastly, I just want to touch on, I'd like to highlight some of the challenges facing the next generation of commercial fishermen. They face daunting challenges, including high cost of entry, limited entry opportunities, and declining opportunities for mentorship and training. In Alaska, these challenges are reflected in the declining number of young people entering the industry and the ongoing attrition of fishing rights from Alaska fishing communities. Not long ago, the agricultural industry faced similar challenges and worked with Congress to create the Beginning Farmers and Ranchers Development Program. The Young Fishermen's Development Act is modeled after the successful concept and aims to create a national program exclusively dedicated to assisting, educating, and training the next generation of commercial fishermen. This bill would ensure America's fishing communities continue to thrive for future generations by supporting economic opportunity, jobs, and food security while preserving a proud heritage and a way of life. We want to thank you again for introducing this bill, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you. Ms. Bonnie.
Senator Sullivan, thank you for the invitation to testify in the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. My name is Julie Bonney, and I am testifying on behalf of the trawl catcher vessels and shore-based processors who are members of Alaska Groundfish Data Bank. For 40 years, the Magnuson-Stevens Act has worked well for Alaska and for my hometown, Kodiak, America's second largest port by volume and third largest by value. The Act and its 10 national standards in their current form appropriately guide council decision-making. We do not support any changes or any additions to the standards or any major changes to the Act. The entire U.S. fishing industry has benefited from the flexibility of the Act. The North Pacific Management Council has solved many regional fishery management issues through its transparent, public, and science-based decision-making process. The best and most creative solutions to management problems have typically come from fishery participants working with the council that understands and values the fisheries they regulate. Council makeup is therefore a key component of successful fishery management. Council should include diverse representation with fisheries expertise and background. Stakeholders from a spectrum of fishing communities, fishermen, and processors affected by the fisheries regulated by the council should all be represented. It is easy to name examples of management programs developed under the Act that benefit communities across Alaska. The Community Quota Entity Program and the allocation of fixed-gear cod licenses were developed by representatives of small rural communities in the Gulf of Alaska. The highly successful Community Development Quota Program benefits coastal communities in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Regional delivery requirements were developed to keep rockfish coming across the dock in Kodiak and crab coming across the docks in the Pribilof Islands. In Alaska, we have benefited from catch share programs in several of our fisheries. These programs have greatly improved fishery data, helping our fishery fleets to self-fund over 50% of the nation's observer days. Alaska Groundfish Data Bank presently manages 7 shore-based harvesting cooperatives in the central Gulf of Alaska rockfish fishery. That catch share program stopped the race for fish, brought community benefits to Kodiak, reduced bycatch, increased harvest efficiencies, and increased fishery monitoring. Our catch share fishery has enjoyed 11 successful years. We agree with the Council Coordination Committee that catch share management needs to remain in the Council's toolbox. Catch share programs are certainly not appropriate for every fishery, so the discretionary nature of the catch share management makes sense. A major theme of the August 1st MSA hearing was sustainably increasing wild harvests for our fisheries to provide greater benefits to the nation. My members believe that the fishing industry can achieve this goal. However, care needs to be taken to make sure that the flexibility is not used to erode conservation objectives. Flexibility to address rebuilding timelines for overfished stocks, to allow harvests of choke species that impede harvests of other fish stocks, and relaxing management measures for data-poor stocks are some of the concepts being promoted. NIMS revised the National Standard 1 guidelines just last year to provide tools to increase flexibility in rebuilding plans, better define ecosystem component species, and phase in changes to catch limits. Whether these new flexibilities strike the right balance should be evaluated before amending the Act. AGDB members are well versed on the highly controversial, complicated, and polarizing topic of fishery bycatch. All fisheries have bycatch. It is unavoidable. Regulating bycatch is important for equity and conservation, but we need to distinguish actions that achieve conservation objectives from those that are largely allocated. Actions that provide little or no benefit to stocks or competing fisheries, but reduce net benefit to the nation, prevent achieving optimum yield, or increasing cost to the fishing fleet should be avoided. The 2006 Reauthorization Magnuson-Stevens Act was an endorsement of the Alaska model. Some small tweaks may be necessary for other regions during this reauthorization process, but in general, it is working well in Alaska. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Bonnie. Ms. Swanson.
Chairman Sullivan, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Magnuson-Stevens Conservation and Management Act. My name is Lori Swanson. I'm the Executive Director of the Marine Conservation Alliance, also known as MCA. Our organization is comprised of harvesters, processors, and fishing-dependent coastal communities with interests in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Gulf of Alaska. MCA is committed to supporting sound, science-based fisheries management in the North Pacific to promote sustainable fisheries and a healthy environment. I'm here to talk about how the current Magnuson-Stevens Act has supported these goals and allowed a sustainable annual harvest of over 2 million metric tons of seafood in the federal fisheries for decades. The MSA is built on 10 national standards which have inherent conflicts. This tension drives the balancing act that preserves the health of our fisheries and the environment that supports them. The hallmark of the MSA is the Regional Fisheries Management Council system, which recognizes that one size does not fit all and allows for solutions that are tailored to the specific problems encountered locally. MCA does not believe there are any systemic issues in the Act that need to be addressed. It appears that most of the concerns that exist are regional in nature, so maintaining and expanding regional flexibility provides the best solution. For example, catch shares are very successful in the North Pacific, reducing bycatch, increasing monitoring levels, and allowing fine-scale catch management. The performance of these programs is reviewed regularly, and modifications are made as necessary through a public process informed by detailed analysis. While we recognize the success of catch share programs in the North Pacific, we also acknowledge that catch shares may not be suitable for fisheries in all regions. Environmental concerns are also addressed at the regional level. The North Pacific Council has established numerous areas where fisheries or gear types are restricted or prohibited. These areas serve a variety of purposes, from protecting sensitive habitats to providing exclusive access to local fishery-dependent communities. The recent review of essential fish habitat in our region determined that the impact from fisheries on habitat is less than 2% region-wide. The North Pacific Council has been refining the practice of ecosystem-based fisheries management, or EBFM, since the first committee was formed in 1996. Annual stock assessments update ecosystem components, and allowable biological catches incorporate ecosystem considerations. The Council developed a fishery ecosystem plan for the Aleutian Islands and is developing a similar plan for the Bering Sea. These plans require adequate data and a sound scientific base, are extremely time-consuming, and are subject to numerous public and scientific reviews. Adding new mandates for FEPs may make the process untenable by putting management in front of science. We believe the development of FEPs, their content, should both remain discretionary. EBFM will continue to be a critical component of our fisheries management. I would also like to comment on the use of best available science in fishery management. Sound science is the bedrock of sustainable fisheries. There are times when what's presented as the best science available may be anecdotal, biased, or untested. It is very important to understand this information prior to using it. Any research from any source should be subject to intense scrutiny before being used in management decisions. And finally, while I recognize this hearing is not focused on scientific funding, I encourage you to maintain adequate funding for scientific research in the North Pacific. Our fisheries are supported by surveys which are conducted annually in many cases, but at least every third year, and annual stock assessments. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this work. Historic survey data provide a long-term view of the effects of years of warm and cold water, changes in the amount of ice cover, and other factors which help scientists understand and predict future challenges. With increased water temperatures, fish are moving between areas and depths, and current survey information is even more critical. Continued funding supports a decades-long database of oceanographic conditions in a region faced with climate change. Further, uncertainty requires more conservative catch limits and reduced harvest levels to ensure the stock is protected. Regular surveys provide increased certainty in the status of our stocks. In summary, the Magnuson-Stevens Act has worked well for over 40 years, and we believe that success must be recognized and protected. I encourage you to refrain from sweeping national changes and to maintain the flexibility for each region to develop and improve upon management programs tailored to their specific needs. Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you for your testimony, and you raised a good point, which is although the hearing isn't focused on the issue of federal funding, I can tell you I'm hearing that issue loud and clear from all the panelists, so thank you for emphasizing that like others have. Mr. Fields, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I've worked for about 30 years with the Gulf of Alaska, smaller rural communities, kind of defined as communities of less than 1,500 people without road access. These are truly fishing communities. That's the only economy in the communities. I was picking fish Monday morning. We were doing good. Lots of fish in the nets, and I thought, why am I coming to this hearing? Oh, we were running Yamaha two-stroke Enduros. They're great engines. But why am I coming to this hearing? And I'm coming because I feel Magnuson has failed the smaller, rural, fishery-dependent communities in Alaska. And this is despite the great national standard aid for providing for the sustained participation of the communities and to mitigate the economic harm to the communities. We see in the smaller communities in the Gulf of Alaska increased and continued separation from the federal fisheries. We saw that initially in, post 1995 when the halibut sablefish IFQ program came into effect. By 2000, we'd already accumulated enough information, sociological and economic information, to see that halibut quota share was migrating from rural communities. The council acted. They enacted something called the CQE program, or the Community Quota Entity Program. It provided opportunities for approximately 45 of these smaller, isolated communities to buy halibut and sablefish quota shares. Of those 45 eligible communities, only 3 have been able to buy halibut shares, and only a few shares at that. This program largely has been a failure, not because of anything the council could have done, but because once quota share is issued, it's almost impossible for a rural community to catch up in terms of buying that quota share and paying the debt service based on the return from fishing the quota share. So I think if we have anything to add to the discussion, Senator, it's that at the outset of any kind of limited access privilege program, if you're going to protect communities, particularly rural communities, those communities are going to need to be awarded quota. And I think we have the CDQ program in Western Alaska as an example of that paradigm and the need for the award quota. So when we go back to Magnuson-Stevens and we look at the community protection provisions under the LAP program, we have two primary provisions. One is communities develop a community sustainability plan. The second provision is regional fishing association. Both of those provisions, from our experience, are flawed so that they're not workable. In fact, the last 10 years, I'm not aware of any council anywhere in the country that has been able to use those provisions to protect those communities. So I think just very briefly, three aspects of those provisions that need to be revised. One is the burden needs to be on the council to show when they develop or initiate a LAP program how that program is going to provide for the sustained participation of that community and the economic protection of that community. So in the purposes or in the provisions of the LAP program, there's 11 provisions. There needs to also be something to say, something to the effect of, and to the effect of how is this program going to protect communities. In addition to that, when you develop a community sustainability plan, there's council-approved criteria that are supposed to be approved by the Secretary, published in the Federal Register, that are available to the communities to develop their community sustainability plan. I'm not aware of any council that has developed this criteria. There needs to be a mandate in this provision to say, before you have a LAP program, the council will develop these communities, or these criteria, so that the community, in developing their community sustainability plan, knows the matrix by which it's going to be judged. Then finally, there's a contingent liability built into the current provision so that the Secretary may withhold or revoke quota share being fished by an individual that's owned by the community. And may or may not give it back either to the individual, but it doesn't specify to the community. As I've talked to investors and NGOs that are interested in helping communities buy quota share, they say that's a showstopper. We can't invest in quota that can be revoked and may or may not come back to the community. So those are the three specific provisions that would help in the community protections. And then finally, in my last 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman, the rural communities in the Gulf of Alaska are very concerned about the amount of discards that are continuing. We have, Magnuson-Stevens National Standard 9. We want to reduce bycatch. We want to reduce mortality by bycatch, but we're still throwing away tens of millions of pounds of dead fish that could enter the stream of commerce, and that's a violation, in my judgment, of National Standard 1 of optimum yield. The Gulf of, in Alaska, generally, we throw over 10 million pounds of halibut annually. We throw that away. This is fundamentally in conflict with the values of our rural communities. Why waste food? And so, Mr. Chairman, and I have a number of other reasons, that as a matter of national policy, we need to focus on the reduction of discards. The European community, by the way, is light years ahead of the United States on this, and they have very strict guidelines or goals set for the reduction of regulatory and economic discards, Mr. Chairman. That concludes the testimony of the Gulf of Alaska Coastal Community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Fields. Ms. Ogilvie.
Chairman Sullivan, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. As Chief Marketing Officer of the American Sport Fishing Association, I hope my perspective, as someone who is involved in a variety of national efforts focused on the future of recreational fishing, can be of value to the subcommittee, and as such I will focus broadly on trends of the sport as a whole and how federal marine fisheries management fits in. The American Sport Fishing Association, or ASA, is the national trade association representing over 800 fishing tackle manufacturers, distributors, retailers, media, and other components of the industry who service the 47 million Americans who recreationally fish each year. We are involved in a wide variety of policy and legislative issues affecting the future of the sport, but devote a significant portion of our advocacy efforts on federal marine fisheries management. Considering that 82% of all fishing trips occur in freshwater, it may seem counterintuitive to focus so much attention on marine fisheries. However, the industry sees tremendous growth opportunities in the saltwater fishing market. The average cost of a saltwater trip is twice that of a freshwater trip. Offshore trips must be taken from a boat, and these boats tend to be larger, consume more fuel, and are outfitted with higher-end gear. Substantial economic opportunities for our industry and associated industries exist with offshore recreational fishing, but we are confronted with a management system that for years has been limiting that opportunity. In contrast, ASA believes that freshwater fisheries management has largely been figured out. Both the state fish and wildlife agencies and the federal land management agencies have a symbiotic relationship with the recreational fishing community. They go above and beyond to communicate with anglers, solicit input, and work together to ensure anglers are satisfied with their experiences on the water. As a result, they are seen as partners in conservation and participation. Conversely, NOAA Fisheries is viewed by many in the recreational fishing community as an adversary. While efforts have been made in recent years to improve the dialogue between the agency and anglers, we have seen little change in the agency's actions and how they translate to fishing opportunities. Fairly or unfairly, the general perception among anglers is that NOAA Fisheries only understands and cares about commercial fishing. While overfishing is now at an all-time low, in many fisheries that has not translated into improved fishing access for recreational fishermen. This is believed to be a result of a management system that fails to recognize that commercial and recreational fishing are different activities. Without question, commercial fishing is tremendously important to the nation by creating jobs and providing a sustainable supply of seafood across our country. My comments are not intended to diminish the importance of commercial fishing, but to recognize that the benefits of recreational fishing are also important and can no longer be an afterthought in the way our federal marine fisheries are managed. As a community comprised of thousands of businesses and the millions of customers they serve, we want modern management approaches, science, and technology to guide decision-making. Since its original passage in 1976 and through subsequent reauthorizations, the Magnuson-Stevens Act has never focused specifically on addressing the unique challenges of federal saltwater recreational fisheries management. We hope Congress will use the current reauthorization process as an opportunity to address this historic inequity, and ASA believes passage of Senate Bill 1520, the Modernizing Recreational Fisheries Management Act, would be a tremendous step towards this goal. By recognizing recreational fishing as an important and distinct activity, Congress and NOAA Fisheries can go a long way toward creating an environment in which saltwater recreational fishing's many benefits to the nation are fully realized. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you again to all the witnesses. I will begin with the same question I asked the other two panels, and I know you've highlighted it already in your testimony, but just to get a strong statement for the record, what do you hope to see in terms of your priorities with regard to any MSA reauthorization? And I'll just open that up to everybody. We begin with Mr. Fields.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really two things from the perspective of the Gulf coastal communities. One is make the provisions under the limited access privilege part of the Act workable for communities. And they're not complex changes, not difficult changes, but make those provisions workable so that a community wanting to participate in a LAP program can develop a community sustainability plan, understand the rules relative to that plan, receive quota, and functionally work with the quota they receive. Second aspect is look at the amount of regulatory and economic discards all across the country. Recognize that times have changed. Look at what Europe's doing. And track the logical progression of, to the extent practicable, and everything's qualified to the extent practical, reduce bycatch, reduce mortality from bycatch, and I would like to add, and if mortality and bycatch are not reduced, don't throw away dead fish. To the extent practicable, utilize what's otherwise discarded. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think at the outset, and several times you noted that you're looking for consensus, and I think after hearing three panels, the consensus seems to really be that ways to improve data and accountability are the best ways forward. So that's certainly something that AMCC would like to see, and the Fishing Communities Coalition. And to that end, we've submitted an amendment package that we think addresses a lot of the accountability and data needs in the MSA. There's small minor tweaks, but we think that they could go a long way forward towards furthering the objectives of the Magnuson Act. And I'd also like to agree with Mr. Fields. We also submitted an amendment that's largely similar to, I think, what he's discussing under 303A, which is just streamlining and improving the LAP provisions so that coastal communities understand what is needed so that they can apply to receive allocations under the LAP program. And finally, I do think, again, that there's an opportunity to address through non-regulatory means, through the Young Fishermen's Development Act, some opportunities for next generation fishermen. And I think because the federal government does manage the fisheries as a public trust, it's a real obligation that they have to see forward. So thank you.
Good, great. Others? Thoughts? Ms. Swanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I echo a lot of what other people have said, that the bones of the act are good. Don't change what's working already. And I don't want to repeat what everyone has already said. One specific issue that I would address is the use of the term overfishing and overfished. I think there should be a better way to express a stock that is depressed from fishing versus a stock that is depressed from an environmental or other factor, and what the mandated response is in those situations. Or we have a blue king crab stock in the Pribilofs that is overfished, even though no fishing occurs on it and hasn't for years. It's unlikely to recover, but there are still mandated recovery plans. That type of structure just, it doesn't make sense. I think it's misleading to the public as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Ms. Bonnie.
Just to follow on with I've got two things. One is the definition of overfishing and the rebuilding plans based on a 10-year rebuilding. I do think that the 10-year rebuilding timeline is arbitrary, and so I think that there might be some room to look at additional flexibility without opening the barn door, so to speak.
Yeah.
Also, in terms of the issue that Lori just raised, which is the blue king crab stocks in the Pribilofs, it's an environmental problem, and yet the only thing that the council can regulate is the fishing activity. So we're restricting fishing, creating a lot of economic impact to the fishing fleet, and there's going to be no net benefit for that stock. So if there would be some kind of way to have maybe the SSC or the science community define a fish that's in that category, that you wouldn't have to go through the rigorous rebuilding plan, I think that would be beneficial.
Great. Ms. Ogilvie?
Yes, from the recreational fishing community's point of view, the two main tenets for reauthorization of Magnuson-Stevens really are the confidence, gaining back the confidence in that data collection, and then recognizing, again, that the recreational commercial fishing are different activities and should be managed so. Thank you.
Let me kind of dig down into a couple more specific questions related to some of the interests and expertise of the different panelists. Mr. Carroll, I know that your organization played an important role in the Alaska Young Fishermen's Network. Can you describe a brief description of the network and what you're trying to do in terms of the successes, and how, as we're looking at this legislation, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the idea of making sure the next generation is able to take advantage, to thrive, to have opportunities, is, I think, one of the most important things we could do. I'm very pleased you're on the panel to represent that kind of group, important interest group. Can you talk a little bit more to that, what you've done?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. And I will point out there's at least one member of the Young Fishermen's Network in the audience today.
Good.
So, we helped create the Young Fishermen's Network largely, for the same reasons that I discussed in my support for the Young Fishermen's Development Act, and that's that we certainly recognize that there are many barriers to entry for next generation fishermen, for beginning fishermen, and largely those are involving access to capital and financial. But in speaking to a lot of our members and fishermen, we really recognize that there's also sort of a networking and mentorship and education gap that's missing, and in part that's due to the outmigration of permits and that loss of institutional knowledge in communities and that sort of feedback loop that you get. But it was a major gap, and as a lot of fishermen now look to make $500,000 to $1 million investments in their future, a lot of concerns revolved around not knowing how to fix the refrigeration system on their boat, and not knowing how to properly pay their taxes. To that end, we started the Young Fishermen's Network as a way to informally improve networking and education among fishermen. And we've seen some really great success. And just one anecdotal story is one of my friends who's a member of the network was out. It was her first season running a boat. It was her first time towing in really rough weather. She called up a few people that she'd met through the network, and they sort of talked her through some strategies to successfully fish, and she ended up having a good day on the water.
Good. Well, let me ask a related question, and this is for either you or Ms. Bonnie or Mr. Fields. There's a lot of talk about barriers to entry in the commercial fleet, whether it's because of the high upfront costs of financing a boat and gear and quota, or just the next generation, right, who don't have those resources. What are there things that we can be looking at, whether it's in the MSA reauthorization or beyond, that can help that issue, particularly in communities like where the two of you reside, Mr. Fields and Ms. Bonnie, in Kodiak, and I think that's a incredible community. Can you talk about the fishing fleet and how important that is, not only in Kodiak but other coastal communities on the island, and this issue of barriers to entry?
And I am probably going to give you a different answer than you expect.
No, I'm asking these because I know there might be different views, which is the whole point of the hearing.
So I think, first of all, you need to understand that the community of Kodiak is very diverse. And so we're kind of the black and white of any fishing community, because we have many participants in the fishery that are involved in the state fisheries, particularly salmon. And then we have a large group of the community that's involved in the federal fisheries. So my life is mostly involved in the federal fisheries because I work for the trawl industry, and that industry brings 20% of all jobs to Kodiak, so it's an important group and we are seeing a lot of new participants in the fishery, just because you're seeing Magnuson happened, Americanization in '86, and so a lot of those people are silver-haired, like I'm working on, and leaving the industry, and so new people are coming in, and who is coming in are the sons and daughters of the owners of the vessels, and the operators and the crew member that are working on the back deck that have experienced some expertise. But in my industry right now, we have a race for fish and fishery environment for the trawl participants, which is not as sophisticated as in the Bering Sea, yet we have a lot of restrictions in terms of bycatch. And so,
can you explain that term? It's used a lot, and I just want other senators who are going to be looking at this transcript and their staff as we talk about the broader issues, what that term means when you talk about the race to fish and how that impacts sustainability, safety, successful management.
So I think it's just because I have these conversations with my family, I'll just put it this way. So if you have a pie, and you put the pie in the middle of the table, and everybody's got a fork, and the goal is to get so a race for fish is trying to get the most pie that you can before your neighbor eats more than you do. The catch share program basically, or allocate to individuals or cooperatives, basically cuts that pie up into individual pieces, and each participant that has a fork at the table gets a slice of the pie. And then you can choose to eat that as slowly or as fast as you want and whenever you want. So it just creates more reason within the way that you're harvesting, and gives you more tools to make a business plan out of it. So coming back to the issue of next generation participants, there's a lot of uncertainty in the industry that I work for because of the system that we're operating under. So they're less likely to be able to get bank loans and enter the fisheries in that way. So for the industry that I work for, we'd like more certainty and more ability to get the fish out of the water and have a business plan versus the system that we live in now. Now, for Duncan's groups and for Shannon's, I think their opinion's different than mine.
Duncan, do you want to comment, Mr. Fields? Just on any of those questions I mentioned.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Yeah. I like Julie's pie metaphor or analogy. But what she didn't amplify is that once those pieces are cut, first of all, they're not all even pieces. And then only those people initially allocated a piece of the pie ever get to eat dessert. That's the barrier to entry that creates the graying of the fleet and the problem for young fishermen. That's it. That's what we're facing. Whether or not it was a state of Alaska limited entry program or a federal IFQ program or a LAP program, Bering Sea crab, for example, each one of those programs creates barriers to entry, and that's an aspect. Now, there's many positive aspects: economic gains, efficiency, safety at sea, not to minimize the positives, but I don't think we as a nation have fully appreciated some of the downstream long-term effects from these limited access programs, particularly in terms of young fishermen entering the fishery. And so in response to my experience in these rural communities, they've been excluded in large part from some of the salmon fisheries because of the permit process, from most of the federal fisheries because of either the LLPs, the permits, or specifically lack of quota share. And now their dads are dying or died, and they don't have any continuity in terms of teaching and training. For example, the community of Uzinki, recent sociological study of the survey of the high school in Uzinki, out of 20 kids, only one thought that he had a future in fisheries. This is a community that one generation ago, everybody in the community participated in the fisheries. In one generation, you've lost fishing in that community. That's the problem, Mr.
So let me ask, and I want to get back to Mr. Carroll, but let me ask a related question. In Bristol Bay, nearly 60% of the permits are now issued to non-Alaskans. So that's a trend that you're kind of touching on in terms of permits leaving Alaska's communities. I'm the chairman of this committee. I'm looking nationally, but of course I'm Alaska's senator, and that trend, that stat causes concern for me. What are ways that we can undertake to address that kind of trend?
I think we straddle two worlds, the state permit world through limited entry, and I think that statistic is more reflective of the state limited entry permit issue. I don't know that we can solve that issue through Magnuson.
No, I know.
But
I'm not saying it's necessarily
there's parallel
Magnuson.
permits in Magnuson called LLPs, and I think we need to look for opportunities for transitional LLPs, for people to fish for a certain number of years under a provisional LLP, and then transition into the fishery. Some of these shoulder kinds of provisions may enable participation in the fishery within the federal sphere. But that trend is continuing. It is alarming for us that believe rural Alaska should have an economy, probably should be a fishing economy. And I think within the state system, there have been some representatives trying to look at the limited entry program to also provide sort of shoulder opportunities for people to transition in to limited entry permits. There's a great program, back to the CDQs, great program that the CDQs have to help young people finance Bristol Bay permits, maybe some of the other CDQs as well. That's not available in the Gulf of Alaska because we don't have that economic base of a CDQ program.
Did you have a comment, Mr. Carroll?
Yeah, just, and I'll be brief, but, getting back to your original question, I think for a lot of people, fishing is a way of life, but at the end of the day, it's still a business. So I think Congress needs to do the best it can to make sure that it's an attractive business to invest into. And I think the way that you do that is to ensure that the Reauthorize Act allows for managers to sustainably manage their fisheries and requires that of them. And then just lastly, as far as what the Act can do to sort of break down some of those barriers to entry, I think there's a lot in it already that empowers the councils to do that. I think if you look back at some of the hearings for the 2006 Act, though, there was a lot of attention paid to whether or not to lift the moratorium on catch share programs. And I think what you see under 303A and the LAP provisions was really an attempt to sort of bridge the gap between a lot of the benefits that come with catch share programs and a lot of the negative economic consequences and socioeconomic consequences in communities. And I think Mr. Fields pointed out that in 10 years, no fishing community has received an allocation under that provision. And that was a really big provision in allowing Congress to lift the moratorium. So I think considering what you can do to really rework that and to sort of honor the original intent of that provision would be a way forward. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Ms. Bond.
And just to follow up on that, I would note that NIMS actually wrote a document that explains how to do a sustainability plan. So you may, if you're going to go down that route, you may want to look at that and see what is in there and what might be missing.
Great. Ms. Swanson, I wanted to turn to you. You know, there was earlier the discussion on, the issue of classified areas of overfish stocks that might not relate directly to overfishing. Can you discuss the effects of the precautionary management and whether or not you think that we talk about overfish stocks, that any under harvesting of stocks is occurring, or do you think that the system and the data and the way in which the council's working is avoiding that issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's an interesting question. Regarding the precautionary principle, I think the idea is sound, that if you don't have adequate information, then you tread very lightly until you do. Where it becomes a problem is where you can't get the information. And that's, I think, why you've heard loud and clear that we need the surveys. Because if our survey information ages, then the ACLs are going to drop because we're uncertain. As far as under harvesting, it's arguable that we are. I mean, the Bering Sea has a 2 million ton cap, which some people believe is arbitrary. Some people believe it's important to the conservation of the system.
What do you believe? Not to put you on the spot.
No, and not speaking for MCA on this.
Well, I've asked this question a lot on the
that's
cap,
okay.
right?
That's
It's an important question, and when it's statutorily defined and hasn't been reviewed, I think it's a legitimate question to ask.
And again, not speaking on behalf of MCA, but myself, I think putting absolute numbers out for anything is generally not a good idea, because you don't know what the right number is. You should have the flexibility to find out what it is. I think having an extremely conservative program in the North Pacific has benefited our stocks, but it has done that likely at the cost of underharvesting. And that, depending on how you view that, that could be a good or a bad thing. I certainly wouldn't advocate lifting the cap altogether, at least not in one step. I think we have to be very, very careful, because you don't know the consequences to other parts of the ecosystem or other fisheries. But generally, I think my overall feeling is that we're in a very fluid environment, not to make a pun, but we're in an environment where the fisheries are changing, the makeup of the fisheries are changing, fish are moving. We heard about halibut moving offshore. We've had surveys that have shown anomalous results. To have a static regulation in that kind of environment is not a good idea. So flexibility, I think is important.
Great. Ms. Ogilvie, can you explain a little bit more the concept of alternative management and whether, that's something that your association is supportive of?
Not an expert on the nuances of the Management Act itself. We are looking for ways to benefit what we're trying to do as a community, which is increase participation. In outdoor recreation as a whole, there's a national effort to increase participation, and for us specifically on the recreational fishing side, it's one of our top priorities of ASA and other organizations such as the Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation, state fish and wildlife agencies, and federal land management agencies, in particular the U.S. Forest Service, are partnering with us on that effort. And we hope that in the federal marine fisheries management space, there is an opportunity to be a partner to, perhaps it is alternative management policies and actions to really focus on the trend of growing more anglers, because we want them to keep pace with how successful we are already being. So, thank you.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm going to ask if there's any other final comments with regard to the witnesses here, and again, if you have a final statement or area of emphasis you want to leave the committee with, welcome any final comments before we close out this third and final panel. So I'll open it up to the panel for any other final comments you may wish to make. Mr. Fields.
Mr. Chairman, I have a real sense of urgency relative to the rural communities in the Gulf of Alaska. You've been in a number of those communities. You've been to Old Harbor. Old Harbor 20 years ago or 35 years ago when I went down there in high school with my wrestling buddies was a vibrant fishing community. It still has a number of boats in the harbor. All but one of those skippers are over 50 years old. In my closing comments, this isn't abstract to me. Changing the community provisions in Magnuson will affect real people that I know, families and communities that I'm engaged with, and it's very important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Ms. Swanson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'm repeating what Mr. Reed mentioned earlier, that sound, verifiable science is key to fisheries management. You receive data from a lot of different sources, from fishermen on the water who see this every day, from universities, from federal research, and all of that data has value. But before it's incorporated into a management system, I think you need to do a very rigorous review of how the data was collected. Has it been peer reviewed? Is it repeatable? I would be very concerned about lowering the bar for the standard of science that we use right now to be more inclusive.
Thank you. Anyone else? Ms. Bonnie?
I guess I'm going to speak to one of the other issues that was brought up for the other two panels, and that is observer coverage.
Yeah.
And so the North Pacific has a very unique program through the partial coverage sector. What's happening is that was a human coverage pool. Now we're integrating the EM side of the pool, and our funding sources is diminished, and all of it's coming self-funded through fishermen, taxing fishermen and processors.
Yeah.
We need help with funding for that program.
Well, we're going to look at that because I think, my understanding of that is that right now it's not equitable in terms of how it's applied in other regions. And if another region pays for it through federal funds, then my view is we should have a similar opportunity to receive that kind of support. So we will be looking at that hard, but thank you for raising that. Anyone else? Yes, Mr. Carroll.
I just want to say thank you for holding this hearing in Alaska, and we appreciate your support.
Absolutely. Great. Ms. Ogilvie, anything?
The same. We are all very appreciative, and conservation is the top of mind, fishing top of mind, keeping our waters clean, abundant with fish, and having access to them. Thank you.
Great. Well, again, I want to, in conclusion, want to thank all the witnesses. I think everybody who's remained, you've been a very patient audience, but I think you've seen we've had 3 great panels, very informative, different views, which of course we knew that was going to happen. I also want to mention the hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, other senators on the committee may be submitting questions for the record to any of the 3 panel witnesses. So we ask respectfully that if you do receive a question from another senator, that the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as practicable. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing again today. I also want to leave an email for anyone else who wants to submit their record of testimony to the committee on this topic. The email is to a committee staffer, Chance, CHANCE _Costello, COSTELLO at commerce.senate.gov. And again, appreciate the panelists. I've certainly learned a lot and look forward to continuing to engage with all the different stakeholders here on this very, very important topic as we move forward. This hearing is adjourned.